Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Advanced Radionic Workshop Series of the 1994 USPA Conference. This morning, our guest and speaker is Dale Pond, who is a past editor of the Journal of Sympathetic Vibratory Physics, which relates to the works of John Worrell Keely. He's a writer, lecturer, and teacher. Presently, he's building a super heat pump, which is based on the technology of Tesla, Keely, and others. This morning, he will be dealing with sympathetic vibratory physics and the science of harmony and music set in triune combinations which Keely used to operate his etheric generators. Dale Pond.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm glad you could all come to witness this fantastic week we have here about radionics and vibration theory. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about John Keely, his history, what he did, what we think he did, the 10 years of research that I've personally put into the subject. And we happen to have a motor here with us today that John Keely himself made. It's been sitting in a museum for many, many years. And I'll explain to you how that works. This will be the second public demonstration on how this particular motor works in the past 130 years since it was invented. He kept it a secret, but we're going to give it out now. Also, I'm going to talk about the science and physics of sympathetic vibrations. Sympathetic vibration is a well-known topic in engineering, although it's not used very much. It is very well known about, has been known about for 200 years or longer. John Keely got into the middle of his vibration research, and he discovered that to really unleash the forces in the universe, we have to work with sympathetic vibrations. And I'll talk to you about those and what they are and why they are. They're very much like resonance, but they're not resonance. Very similar to that. Is there anyone in the audience who hasn't heard of John Keely, doesn't know what he did? Quite a few. Mr. Keely was born in 1837 near Philadelphia. As a youngster, he was always interested in sound and music and vibration, things of that nature, especially during church when he saw the windows vibrate when the choir sang. And he got real curious about what caused that resonance in the windows. And that began his long career. One of the most fantastic scientific researchers in history was this man, John Keely, and he kind of got buried. He died in 1898, but that brief period from the 1860s, late 1860s to 1890s, he did an incredible amount of research into vibration, molecular and atomic structures. He worked with radioactivity, or radiation rather, not radioactivity as we know it. It was quite a bit different. His was benign, was absolutely harmless when understood and worked with properly. Several times he blew the back end of his laboratory out, so it can be very dangerous. And he was the expert, and he kept losing it once in a while. In 1872, some investors came to him. He had built the first prototype of this particular motor in the late 1860s. In 1872, some promoters and businessmen in Philadelphia came to him and said, why don't we form a company, a stock company, and we'll sell stock and we'll get enough money to develop this motor and bring it onto the market. So that began the time of the Keely Motor Company business, which has a very colorful history. Over a period of 10 years or so, they managed to develop $6 million of investments into the development of this motor. However, most of that money went to the guys who had the stock, which was these business people, and Keely never really saw much of it. He only had enough of it to keep building new machines and older machines. This particular motor operates on water and sound. He made 129 versions of this motor. We don't know which model this one is, although we're pretty sure it was one of the later versions. It was very, very refined. The one single patent that Keely filed that we've been able to locate was filed in 1874 on this motor, but it was a very crude design. And we have copies of that patent. We have a little bookstore over in the other room where we have all of this material we've been able to get our hands on and is available on that subject. Fundamentally, this motor would draw in water, just plain old water, into itself using a vacuum and I'll explain the different components to it as we go along. Once the motor got to vibrating, and it would start to vibrate on its own, this water would begin to pulsate. And pulsations in a water stream is called water hammer. When you shut off a water stream, you get this water hammer effect. And that is where an etheric vapor is evolved in the process of water hammer. This is technically known today as cavitation. There's 4 types of cavitation, one of which is called acoustic cavitation, which is what's used in this motor. During the process of a cavitation, or as is sometimes referred to in these circles, implosion is the same thing as cavitation. So you get the imploding of these forces. It's the female force of the ancients. This implosion cavitation is the female force being released in these machines. It has been established in modern engineering. You can find it in any book on cavitation. There's only 2 books on cavitation ever been written that I've been able to track down, and both of them say the same thing. There are infinite levels of energy being released during the process of cavitation, this imploding. When you got the expanded gaseous vapors, when they collapse, that's the implosion. When they collapse in the cavitation process, there is released infinite levels of energy. And all the scientists who've written on the subject claim the same thing again, that they do not know what's going on. They see this thing, they measure it, they photograph it, they've got all these technical studies on it, but they do not understand what's happening. It's totally foreign to the male-based science that we have going on today. This is the evolution and the opening up of the female force that has been occulted in the old metaphysics and the old mystical circles for centuries and centuries. John Keely stumbled on it, and this was his gallant effort to harness these incredible forces. I believe it was in 1888 or 1889, Keely decided he was not going to pursue this type of motor development any longer. He figured that he was not able to capture the etheric force and turn it into a motive force, as in a motor, to suit the purposes that they were trying to do. About the same time, a very wealthy lady from Philadelphia, Mrs. Clara Bloomfield Moore, came into Keely's life in a benefactress, and she told Keely that if he would stop trying to make a motor, make a commercial enterprise out of this thing, and begin his scientific investigation of this phenomena that he was working with, she would fund his research, pure research. He agreed, and she funded his work for the next 10 years. Pure scientific research. That's why we don't see any more machines than we've got this one and one other one in Vermont. In 1893, Keely had finished his study of research. He left the etheric vapor side of it, and he went into a new side of it, which I call negative attractive forces. He built a whole class of machines when he left this machine and went into the negative attractive energies. These are the female forces. These are the high vibration forces in these new machines where he could actually, and he did, he built machines where his mind was keyed to the machine. If he thought a certain symbol or a certain word or whatever, these machines would start or they would stop. Only he could start them and operate them. Later on, he devised methods that anybody could operate these same machines, but it was based on mind energy. Eventually, he came to say and to teach us that all force in the universe is mind force, just operating in different realms. All force is mind force. And he tapped into this infinite realm of energy. And we'll go on to explain how that's all tied together. It will also explain a great deal about this radionics research where symbolism plays such a big part. And we say, well, this looks like magic and science can't explain it, they can't accept it, but we do have means and methods now that we can tie these things to conventional engineering where it makes sense. And we'll get into that a little bit too. First I want to explain this motor a little bit so you have some of the history behind what we're dealing with, and then we'll go into some of the vibration physics. This little... Is that all right? Okay. This motor was given to one of Keely's lawyers in the late 1800s. We assume it was given to him, or was part payment or whatever, we don't know exactly. Mr. Housen. Later on, he donated this to the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia, and it sat in the Franklin Institute for 50 years. And they had a little sign on it that said it was a perpetual motion machine. Well, it was not a perpetual motion machine. They called it that because they didn't know what it was or how it worked, or they didn't have any idea about it. They just called it perpetual motion. And my friend Victor Hansen, who is in the other room, he owns this machine. He bought it from the Franklin Institute for $1,000. Took him 8 years to get the money together to pay for it. He eventually got it and took it home. And he had it since the 40s. So he's had it for another 50 years. 3 or 4 years ago, I had a chance to look at it for the first time. And if any of you are engineers and you look at this thing, you say, it is absolutely bizarre. There's no way this thing can work. Because in conventional male-oriented physics, where we put in energy, we got to hit it with something, you know. This makes no sense because it doesn't operate with that philosophy. It operates with the female forces of implosion. So the thing kind of operates backwards. And when you look at it a little bit and you say, well, this thing operates backwards, and then all of a sudden your mind just gets all clouded and confused because you're not used to thinking in those terms. But after a while, it gets kind of simple. And this is brilliant. If Keely did anything, he was a brilliant machinist and a brilliant mechanic. He just had a cleverness of making things. Water would come in through this orifice. Once he got the thing primed with water in the system, he could just kind of give this thing a little crank, and it would create a vacuum, and the water would draw itself through the machine. Now, one interesting concept is the water formed a part of the mechanism. That's not normal physics. That's not normal engineering. We don't normally do that, where the water is actually part of the motion of the machine. So this thing is kind of like a holistic machine. It's not a machine operating on the water or the water operating on a machine. It's the water and the machine operating together as a whole unit. It's kind of like the human body does. So I give this thing a crank. Water will come into here above this level of this tube, this horizontal tube that goes across the front. The tube goes through this pulsating chamber. I call this a pulsating chamber. And the tubes are hollow. There's nothing inside of them. The same thing with this tube. It's just a straight tube. There are holes in the center so that it has access to the internal volume of this pulsating chamber. This chamber is 1/64 of an inch in thickness. It is red brass. It's very hard, very resonant type brass, whereas this is a yellow brass. This is red brass, kind of like a naval brass. And the interesting thing is, once the water came into this and started through the system, this chamber would begin to pulsate. And because it's mostly got air in it, we would have a pulsation of a high and low pressure forming at intervals, very high frequency. So this becomes a pump. Once the water is in motion, this pulsating chamber becomes a pump with no moving parts. It's really ingenious. Just a year ago, I ran across a NASA paper where these guys, some engineer, didn't even have his name on the paper, had designed a waveguide using a transducer, and he had developed a pump using a transducer, there again with no moving parts. So here was a validation from NASA that this concept works. And I thought that was really good that we ran into that paper. In these two mechanisms, one on each side, these are check valves. The water would come across horizontally and start up through this check valve, and all it is a round ball sitting on a round hole. So water could come this way, but it can't go back down. Then the water would come through these pipes around here, there's two on each side, into these pistons. Now, there's two kinds of pistons. This is kind of an enigma why there's two distinct designs on these pistons. They are not the same. And this left side, your right side, we have what we consider a standard piston arrangement. Underneath, we have a bar that goes underneath that pushes a piston up into this larger chamber. The water would come into the top of that cylinder, on top of that piston. And in the end, there's a valve that goes straight through here. It's a rotary valve so it just rotates. In this case, it just rocks back and forth. So the water could come through that cylinder. When the valve got in the right place, the water would shoot through into this cylinder, pushing this crankshaft and causing it to rotate. It's real simple. However, the things that go on while it's doing all of that is really neat. The pulsations would drive the water past the check valves into this cylinder down here, pushing this rod down, which lifted this weight on the far side here. So it would lift this weight on the far side, thereby putting pressure on this water in this cylinder. So here we've got water under tremendous pressure because the injections of the pulsating waves pounding that water. The minute the little rocker arm rocked the valve back and forth, we've got a high velocity stream of water coming past the valve. So when you close the valve on high velocity water, what do you get? You get a water hammer. You get that pounding. And water hammer is when you close the faucet in your sink and the pipes bang in your basement. That's water hammer. There's infinite pressure in that. So that pressure, I did a computer model of what happens in here. And of course, the computer model is based on ideal conditions, which this isn't. But I was surprised that it showed within 8 cycles of this valve opening and closing, the pressure goes to infinity. Now that's an ideal situation, which this isn't. So we got the high-speed stream of water coming through the valve system, pushing this piston up, and would cause a little bit of rotation. And on the other side, there's 2 types of water hammer, by the way. There's upstream and downstream. Water coming into a valve. You shut the valve, that water has a momentum that keeps going against the valve. And the reverberation of this shock wave going back upstream, away from the valve, creates a pocket of negative pressure, low pressure, vacuum, which will collapse as you impose, causing a pounding. On the downstream side, the water wants to keep going, so it creates another vacuum, which collapses and causes another shock wave. So if we time that shock wave back and forth on either side of the valve, it goes upstream up the pipe, and then it comes back down. If you open the valve at the same time that reverberation of the shock wave comes back, it will add to the original one. It's like a child on a swing. You push a child on a swing. If you push it at the right moment, it'll get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And by the way, that is the same principle that Morey used in his valve assemblies in the 1930s and 40s, where he caused an oscillation of electrical current. It's much like Bearden talks about today with scalar electromagnetics, where they got bifilar coils, and they got this tremendous charge of current, not current, but potential, that they oscillate back and forth. So we've created a potential in here, and we oscillate it back and forth, and the valve lets loose just enough to keep the mechanism going. On the other side, there is a slightly different, well, it's fundamentally different thing happening. Because this piston down here does not capture water. It is a round ball sitting in a round hole. So when the water squirts through here, it hits on top of this ball and then goes immediately all over the place. But while it does that, it creates a vaporized situation on top of that sphere, and it polarizes the water. Right above the round portion, we have a little chamber in here. It's a little square chamber, and that bothered me for 2 years, what this chamber was all about, because it's a rectangular hole going through this little chamber. That when the ball closes, it closes one end of it, and when the valve closes, the other end of it's closed. And I got to thinking about waveguides and whatnot. This thing is a waveguide. When both the valve and the piston are open, we have a certain fundamental frequency. When one or the other closes, the frequency goes up nearly 4 times. And I think that's in my paper. When that happens, based on the dimensions of this waveguide, we have microwave frequencies in operation on this water vapor. Microwave frequencies from a mechanical mechanism. It's absolutely incredible. So we get this water vapor in here, and what happens when you microwave water? So we get a high potential expansion rate of the water going through this valve and driving this piston. So we've got 2 different drive mechanisms working on this little motor. So the guy was a genius. There's no doubt about it, and this was a machine he gave up on. He went on to better and more higher things that we're only now beginning to get any kind of idea about. Any questions on this motor, or the water phenomenon, or the cavitation, the water hammer?
Can you fire it up?
No, it's not operational. It was about 2 years ago when I finally hit on the idea that it was water hammer. We did change some of the pipes because they were all split and broken, and some of the joints were broken. We soldered those up. We put new gaskets in it. And we put it in a bathtub, and we ran a little bit of water into it. And it was kind of phenomenal what happened. The thing like it came alive. It just kind of, like it came alive. And but it didn't operate as we think it should operate. And we feel that's because of the timing mechanism in these valves. We don't understand those yet. So we really didn't know how to deal with those. And first and foremost is this is an original priceless antique. We didn't want to mess with it very much. Just enough to see if my idea was correct about the water hammer, which we did prove and verify. So eventually, if we ever get any money, we're going to exactly duplicate this thing, and then we can play with that model all we want to. Yeah, you had a question?
Raise your hand if you have a question so I can get it on mic. All right, let's go ahead.
What would it cost to produce one of those machines?
I think machinist time is about between $30 and $60 an hour. It would take a lot of money. It would take several thousands of dollars, just machine work, to duplicate it. Now, another idea is once we know the principles of how this thing works, we can design our own from scratch using electronic valves, so we get rid of the friction phenomena and all that kind of stuff. And I think we do understand it enough to design our own from scratch. And I do have some designs that I've worked with. I've got various devices that I've been working on the designs of that we may be able to build. Yes, sir.
Have you heard of the 300 mile an hour submarine? A gentleman, I believe it was in the 50s, built one as a one-man submarine. He crossed the Atlantic Ocean in about 24 hours, something like that. But I think he was using a turbine. But a turbine could be set up to use the cavitation principle. Each blade of the turbine would be making a cavitation.
Okay, that's a very good question. No, I haven't heard of that particular machine or that event. Using turbines is very interesting because the Tesla turbine, for instance, where you have the smooth discs, I have a model of it over on the workbench over there, on the book table. When it draws water in, if the velocity of that draw exceeds a certain point, the water cavitates, and it will cease to draw. Any pump will do that, can create that phenomenon. So you can only draw water in at a certain given velocity. However, I believe the same thing happens with air in jet engines. They can cavitate and they'll flame out and all that kind of stuff. Any fluid will do that. So certain designs, like the Schallberger material, seem to indicate that we can supersede, we can increase that ability, or we can push back that threshold of cavitation to a great extent and thereby increase velocities and attain those things that you're referring to. I believe Keely was doing some of that work too. Although there is another way of how do you call it, propelling a craft or a mechanism that is not male-oriented. And we can get into that too. Remind me of that and we'll cross into that. You have a question?
Dale, the opposing counterweights, what do they do? Is it perhaps that one motor goes for a while and then the other side goes where those counterweights come up and down?
That's part of the questions we haven't answered in this particular design. We know that this weight maintains a pressure against this piston. This is what maintains the pressure within this cylinder, so that when this valve opens, it has that velocity to the water stream. This one over here maintains this piston closed. So when the water ejects against it, there's a certain resistance to the water stream. And I thought, well, why couldn't we use spring-loaded mechanism instead of these weights? And there is a different reaction to these weights coming down as opposed to a spring mechanism. And also in the 1880s, they didn't have the materials we got today, so he probably couldn't build a good spring like we can today. So there's many different questions. We don't have them all answered. You know, we've got the basic phenomena figured out, but why did he do this and do that and not the other thing? We can only conjecture. And the timing, each cylinder has its own timing, and how they work, plus the timing in the timing gears.
Comment on the spring. The acceleration from a spring is totally different from the acceleration of a released weight. So you wouldn't get an instantaneous switch or as rapid a switch. It would be a more gradual switch. So a spring would have a totally different mechanical phenomenology. And if you're opening and closing a valve, that's probably the best way.
Yeah, I agree with that. That's kind of what I came up with. I had built a model of this cylinder, and I used a spring because I didn't want to build all this mechanical stuff, just to prove that I could capture pressure with water hammer, and it did do that. So we can do those things. And I think if we had more engineering expertise working on this problem, we could come up with all kinds of solutions to it.
Yeah, Dale, you said that you'd only found 2 books on cavitation.
Right.
Do you think the level of knowledge in physics right now is sufficient for you to be able to model the cavitation effect of this machine, say?
Yeah.
For example, you think that the theoretical development in physics, the level is high enough right now? All the concepts that we need to involve here present in physics sufficiently that we might be able to mathematically model this machine?
Easily.
You think so?
Easily, yeah. What goes on in here once you start to model it is real simple. It is echoes of shock waves and things like that. We know a lot about shock waves.
About shock waves, yeah.
And water hammer is a study of these shock waves within a given mechanism, water pipes. So that's where the breakdown occurs, is when you try and take the mathematical formulae for water hammer and apply it to this engine. Well, it starts breaking down because those are designed for water tubing and piping and whatnot, and this isn't. So we've got to modify them to a certain degree to bring them into coincidence with what goes on here. But I do not think that what is happening here is beyond our current technology. Now, this negative attraction stuff is beyond our current technology.
Negative attraction. Could you explain that a little more, to negative attraction?
Well, I got to give you some basics first. We'll go through some basics. We can leave this for now. We can come back to it. Anybody got any questions? We can come back to it. We're going to do some other things. The universe is a musical construct. Everything in the universe vibrates. Everything. There is nothing that does not vibrate. So we can almost say that there is nothing in the universe except vibration. Centralized and decentralized vibration, or polarized and depolarized vibration. That's what causes particles to come together and to go apart. And we're going to go right into all these details of how this is done according to Keely's philosophy, which we find out is not that much divergent from modern philosophy. This guy did all this work over 100 years ago. The electron, by the way, was officially recognized in 1893. I think it was Rutherford who got the credit for that. All of this that I'm going to show you now precedes that by at least 10 years and sometimes 20 years. First thing I want to show you, is what is a vibration. We talk about vibration, we teach about it, and yet I'm not sure we really understand what it is. This is a conventional description of a sine wave. It is what we generally consider in standard engineering what a vibration is. Where we've got a positive phase to a vibration and a negative phase to a vibration, and in the center we've got a neutral phase of these vibrations. Now, in my study and working with Keely for over 10 years trying to understand what they were doing, this is a graphic representation of measurements. It is not a vibration. It is a graphic representation of changing amplitudes. If we have a point source over here for sound, and the sound's traveling in this direction, and we've got a microphone at any position in here, the rarefactions and condensations of the air waves, as the sound goes through the air, that's what sound is. It's a rarefaction and compression wave. This is what compresses the particles together of the air, and this is what is when we have a rarefaction. Okay? So as it passes the microphone, we get an up and down measurement. The meter goes up and down, but it doesn't really tell us anything. Okay, so what's happening is we've got an expansion and a contraction. The expanding radiating force, that's what the ancients called a male force. It goes out, it radiates out, it impacts things. It's like the sledgehammer approach we use in physics today. You've got to put all this energy into a system to get anything back. And that's only a third of the story. Another third of the story, or almost a whole half of it, is the female side of this vibration. That's this side down here. This is the rarefaction. This is once it expands out, then you get the collapse. The collapse is that female force. What is it that causes this collapse? Here's a whole field of science modern science is ignoring. They don't even acknowledge it. They're just beginning to. They're beginning to suspect that there's something there. Just like women's liberation is just now beginning to happen. We're just now beginning to recognize that women exist. It's really strange. But the parallels in philosophy and science and life, they are absolute. That's the way it works. Negative attraction. So here we go. We got radiating propulsive force going outwards. We got an attracting force that comes to the center. So it's a positive propulsive going out. It's a negative attraction coming in. So the negative attraction is the female force. And that's the basic principle behind that and what it is. So we got the night side forces. That's negative attractive. The ancients Casey talked about that quite a bit, the night side forces. The Atlanteans, the stories go about the Navaz energy. That's night side force, the dark side forces. But they aren't evil in any way, shape, or form. And because one's positive and the other's negative is not one's good or bad. It's just two polarities. It's like a coin. You can't have a coin with one side. It's got to have two sides or there's nothing there. So it's the other side of the duality of mankind. Mankind is a neutral characterization of a duality, male and female. Okay. So we got the forces. In fact, I had a chance to talk to a nuclear scientist. He was a retired Army. He died a few years ago. But he used to design nuclear weapons. And we got to talking about it, and he said, you know, it's not the explosion of this bomb that's destructive. It is the implosion after that explosion has taken place. That implosion to the center of 0 point is what causes all the destruction. The negative force is where all the force is that we really need to deal with. It is a gentle force, it is a nurturing force, it is a subtle force.
But this is really the yin and yang of family.
Yin and yang, that's exactly right.
You take those two spheres, you put them together, and you put them apart.
That's right. In fact, I've got a really neat design here that shows these dynamic forces. In this chart, I kind of did a little playing around with it, but over here we can see the three particles within this, by the way, let's start in the beginning, or we're going to get you lost. This is a simple molecule in Keely's morphology, his molecular morphology. This large thing is what he called a simple molecule. It's not a complex molecule like a plastic molecule. It's just a simple molecule, within which are three, what he called inner molecules. That's what these three in the center are. Every particle, he said, had the same configuration. It's the internal constructs which are different. Inside each of these is another three, and inside that another three, on down to infinity. And this is the root of this science. This in another chart This drawing was originally published in 1886 by John Keely. This is modified. I just redrew this to have this transparency. But we can see that we've got the molecule, the inner molecule, the atom, the inner atom, on down to 8 levels. Keely built machinery to investigate these 8 levels of material substance. Now in these 8 levels, he got to the 8th level, and he says, I can't build machinery fine enough to investigate the 9th level. So he referred to the 9th levels as the infinite ninths. They went infinitely beyond his capability of investigating them. Now, correspondence with today's science, I can show you that. This is a revelation. These are my 2 best charts. And these are fundamental to understanding this science. We're going right to the heart of this one real quick. What we have, here's the molecular level, the largest circle, the intermolecular, atomic, etheric, interetheric, all the way to the infinite ninth. Now this is Keely's development right here. The ancients called it earth, water, air, fire, ether, mind, and God was the infinite ninth. And in modern science, solid, liquid, gases, plasma, photonic, quarkian, and from there it's a guess as to how they put all this thing together. But we know modern quantum mechanics says there's 3 quarks in a photon, and there's 3 photons in an electron. That's modern quantum physics, guys. And we got the same chart that Keely had over 100 years ago. Now what this means is the larger the item, and this is basic acoustics, for those of you who know anything about sound, the larger the item, the longer the wavelength, the lower the frequency. So the higher we go up these levels, we get shorter and shorter wavelengths, and we get higher and higher energy states. Keely maintained 30 years before Einstein that the faster something moved, the more compact it got. And the more compact it got, the more energy it contained. When Einstein hit the scene, he plagiarized all these things, and he wrote it like this. That's what he said. Energy equals mass times speed of light squared. But he stopped at the electronic level. If you go into the quantum level, which he hadn't gone into, this doesn't necessarily apply in this particular way that it's phrased. But what this says, the faster something goes, the higher the energy content. That's what it says. So you get down here, the faster something goes, the greater the energy content. So these smaller subatomic elementary particles have greater energy content than the grosser, more mundane, more material items such as molecular matter. So here's we're slowly approaching to a definition of this negative attractive energy and these subtle energies that are used in radionics. This is where we're trying to get to. So, having established that premise, and please interrupt me with questions. Anybody got any questions? Please just jump right in, because we may cover a lot of stuff too quick.
These are available, Mr. Charles, right?
Beg your pardon?
Charts and photographs, they're available.
They are available?
I'm asking you.
Yes, they are. I have some books on it at the book table. I also have a computer program. I spent 10 years putting this computer program together. It's got 11 megabytes of this information in it, and all related types of information. It's a vast, vast field, and I don't think any one man could ever master it. So we say, how does all these things connect together? And I'll show you that. It's really simple. If we have 2 items down here that are seemingly unrelated one to another, you know, me and a guy over in Africa, we're basically unrelated to each other, it doesn't matter. Or a stone here and a stone on the Rocky Mountains, doesn't matter. These are harmonic progressions, what general engineering considers as harmonic progressions. Whatever the frequency of this object is, if you double that, you get the harmonic progression or the harmonic series of this object. Okay, engineering uses that every day. It's a real simple concept. Music uses it every day. We can take something over here and we say it's fundamental. It's a little bit different. So we don't really see any correspondences in these numbers. However, the basic arithmetic as is found in music theory, and I want to stress this, it is a musical universe. because everything vibrates, and vibrations are controlled or maintained by number, whole numbers, and how they interact with each other. Pythagoras had it answered 2,000 years ago, and he kind of got swept to the side because we had, or we have still today, a partial philosophy. We don't have a holistic viewpoint of nature. Those old philosophers studied many, many, many fields of subjects, especially music and astronomy and arithmetic, and they could see the correspondences between all these fields. Well, somehow we've gotten into a place now where we study one field and we pick that thing apart and we don't really know anything about any other fields. We've become specialists, and that has led us down some really bad paths. What we're trying to do here is show you how it can be all tied together very simply to the underlying principles that connect it all together. In music, it is maintained, and there's some music experts in here, and I'm not a music expert. I'm just learning like everybody else. If we take the aliquot parts of a given frequency, those are the numbers that add up to create a given number. Like it's factoring. You use factoring in algebra to come up with the aliquot parts of a given number. 2 is an aliquot part of 6, 12, 24, 48. So here we can see a connecting link between these numbers right now, right here. 2 will go into these. So we have a partial harmony or concordance established between these two separate, seemingly separated objects. Another thing that happens in music is called modulation. It's not very well understood by most lay people, but it's a real simple thing. Frequencies will add together and they will subtract. It's called additive and subtractive synthesis. We can take any of these numbers and add them together. This is what happens naturally in sound and vibration. So we can take 4 and 8, and we got 12, and look what happens. We get a correspondence over here directly with this seemingly separated, isolated object. I had a gentleman come to me a couple years ago, and he says, we would like you to design a radionics machine that is operator independent on these high levels of the etheric sciences that Keely had been dealing in. And I says, it can't be done. No machine can ever be isolated from its operator. And this shows why. And we're going to go here a little bit further and show you why. Now these progressions of numbers can go up in frequency. This is going up in frequency, but they can also go down. So you got the exact same thing going down, only we get into the fractions. And this goes to infinity too. So what we just got done saying over here on this chart right here, the higher the frequency, the greater the energy content. Another phenomenon in sound, a basic rule of thumb is the higher the density of the media of propagation, the greater the velocity of propagation. That's a standard rule of thumb. If we go up here to an infinitely high level, we've got particles that have infinitely high energy content, and they've got infinitely small dimensions. Therefore, that realm has an infinitely high density. So the propagation of a wave through that media is going to be an infinite velocity. I mean, it's just common sense. So what happens when you pull a vacuum? How do you isolate this thing called negative attraction? If you pull a vacuum, what are you doing? You're pulling out the molecules, you're pulling out the atoms, the isotopes, and you're creating this space that does not have these larger, slower particles in it. But it's still got these really high, infinitely small particles in it. You can prove that just by looking at a vacuum chamber. You can see through it, which means it's got photons in it. You can broadcast radio waves through it, so it's got electrons in it. And if it's got those in it, it's got the smaller particles. When you get into these higher realms, let's assume that you could pull a vacuum of 100 psi, which modern science can't do. Keely claimed to have done it over and over and over again. What you have left in that chamber would be synonymous with this negative attractive energy because it wants to collapse itself. And what is in there? What we just say was in there is infinite energy in there. That's what's in here. And this shows how they're all connected together on infinitely high levels. So this is the basis of how radionics machines operate. We can tune knobs. If you do the potentiometer thing, you're just tuning a certain potential in these instruments. You're setting up certain waveforms and frequencies. But you say, well, how does that propagate through the atmosphere? Well, it doesn't propagate through the atmosphere. It goes up this ladder, and the high harmonics propagate through the atmosphere. Actually, it's in between the atmosphere. It doesn't go through the atmosphere at all. So it goes across to the target that has the same chord of frequencies. I think Sherry Edwards called it signature. That's a modern term for it, signature vibrations. Keely referred to it as chords of mass. So if you've got any given object, if we go back to this one chart, we can see that there's 3 major particles in here, and then there's 3 in each of those. So therefore, an atom, a molecule such as this, has a fundamental tone, which is the frequency of this larger particle, generally speaking, but it has all these other frequencies in it too. And I think if we count to the 8th level, there's over 1,000 particles in this thing. So there's 1,000 different frequencies times 3 again. So it just goes on to infinity. So each object, material object, has a whole plenum of frequencies of which we need to identify the fundamental keynote tone. And musicians understand keynotes and fundamental tones. Those are the tones at which a given object will vibrate or resonate. Music is a whole subject. We could talk for a week on music. Now I want to show you, in the ancient literature, they talk about materiality as an illusion. I'll show you where they came up with that. And it indeed is an illusion. These particles rotate on planes 90 degrees to each other. So this particle would go in a big circle like this one would go in a circle like that, and that one would go in an orbit like that. 3 planes of orbit, just like you see in modern physics. You got the 3 planes like that. So they spin at each other, around each other. This is not a shell. Even though Keely maintained there was a shell about this, the shell is a construct. There is no thing here. This line only defines the range of motion of these particles. So they'll rotate about each other, but they won't exceed this range. So it's like a bicycle wheel. If you spin it real fast, you can't really shove a stick through it. If you spun it at an infinite velocity, which this almost is, you couldn't shoot a bullet through it or hit it in an atom smasher or anything else. You're not going to penetrate this range of motion. So there really is nothing here. The same thing with these particles here. These things rotating inside this thing, this is just a range of motion. There's no object here. There's no hard shell here. On down into the infinite level. So when you get all done, it's like peeling an onion. There's nothing there. There is no thing there. So that's where the ancients got that thing about it's all energy. There's no materiality as an illusion, because it is. Now another thing Keely dealt with is kind of extraordinary, and we're just now beginning to get the idea that maybe we can do this too. All the frequencies of this molecule are in harmony with each other. That's like what we got done drawing here. If they're all in harmony with each other, they will tend to stay together. The molecule will hold itself together. That's the negative attractive force holding itself together. That's harmony. The minute you introduce an inharmonic tone, a tone that is different from the concord that's established there, this thing will start to agitate. It's like if you got a group of people that get along really well together, and then somebody comes in and they just start agitating everybody. The team goes, the team players go, the whole thing starts crumbling apart. Same thing in an orchestra. If everybody's playing in tune, we'll make beautiful music. But you get a guy in there starting to shriek on his oboe or whatever, and the place falls apart. Same thing happens with a molecule. If we took an inharmonic tone and introduced it into the structure, it'll just come apart. We don't have to hit it with a sledgehammer. It'll just come apart. And that's how Keely was able to investigate 8 levels, which we can't do today. We're trying to use atom smashers that cost umpteen billions of dollars, and we're not really doing anything. We're not making it. Any questions on this thing so far? By the way, the black areas are considered the negative side, the female side. The black areas, the white areas, the male force. They're positive charged. The black side is negative charged. The gray areas are neutral.
Oh, I'd just like to comment that this has the characteristics of a fractal, you know.
Oh, yes.
I don't know if you recognize that or not.
Yes.
Yeah. So perhaps it can be approached with the mathematical fractals to some degree, because that's exactly what a fractal is. No matter how deep a level you go to, the patterns just keep repeating themselves over and over again. And so as the size reduces, the energy goes up. So that's sort of like a reverse fractal in the opposite direction. Yeah.
That's exactly right. That's one of the basic principles of music, by the way, is how the entire construct, it's like these numbers right here, no matter where you go on this scale, the same thing applies in the same way. So these are the natural fundamental principles through which the universe operates. And once we understand those, like this fractal business, then we'll come. In fact, let me say that right now before we get too far, and I'll get right to you. The fractal mechanism This is the basic fractal mechanism, the mathematical construct of a fractal. A fractal is a mathematical thing, okay? What we see in the pretty pictures on fractals is what the computer can generate from those numbers. Well, this is what generates the numbers. If we have a given input, comes in here, we work a change on that input, and it comes out over here. But it's modified in some way by this modifier. And that's all a fractal is. So we can get in here and we can make A as complicated or whatever we want it to be and do the same thing with a modifier, and we just keep going back through that modifier over and over and over and over again. And we get those beautiful patterns. Music does the same thing because we always work with A, B, C, D, E, F, G. No matter what the octave. We can start at the lowest possible octave and we can go up to the highest possible octaves, like in light, 46 or 48 frequency octave, and do that because it's all the same stuff. There is no difference. This, by the way, is the neutral, corresponds to the neutral in these charts where you see the gray. We can get into that too. Yes?
I'm not exactly sure how these thoughts are coming. I'm really involved in researching health and the physical body, and I can see where vibrations of negative thoughts, stress, chemically induced negative vibrations could start the spin on the molecule in the body and create the inharmonic vibrations which result in disease. And that would explain why music therapy and why even singing or doing things for yourself to tune the body, they talk about tuning and balancing, that would override that program to put it back into a state of harmonics so that they would start flowing and vibrating together in a harmonic state. Is that basically what...
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Where we go into the infinite nights, or the eighth level of these particles, is mind energy. Those are the particles associated with mind. Now, in Keely's work, and I have these beautiful drawings and charts that Keely left us. I have them over my table. Anybody's welcome to come by and look at them. He left us these incredible charts of the human brain. Now, the brain is the physical mechanism, the physical substance between our ears. The mind is something else. The brain he considered as an acoustic resonator. The convolutions of the brain determine the various frequencies of the physical brain. Sound, in the ancient literature, sound was what caused the universe to be. Sound is a rarefaction, compression of whatever particle media we're dealing with. If it's the etheric realm, then it's those etheric particles. If it's the molecular realm, it's like water. We see the water waves, same difference. Mind is a range of particles on the eighth level of this thing, so every particle in the universe is composed of mind particles. That's why telepathy works. That's why telekinesis works, because we can communicate, we can become in sympathy with those particles of that spoon or whatever it is we're bending or working with, and it will do our bidding. In that regard, we are the image of God, because we are in touch with this level of energy, because that's what we are. So when we meditate and we get real quiet and we cease to cause inharmonic disturbances within our organism, then the purity of that stream of energy can expand and express itself in a more pure form. So yes, you're right. But this shows, Keely's work shows how those things are connected one to the other. Now what I needed to say again, and I kind of left this off, what we're talking about is the physics of sympathetic vibration. In high school physics, they teach if you have a tuning fork of one frequency over here and you got the tuning fork over here, the same tone, you vibrate this one responds. That is done via sympathetic vibrations. Sympathetic vibration is a vibration that is sympathetic to both organisms, to both bodies. That's what a sympathetic vibration is. So this vibration in here and this one here would both be sympathetic streams of vibrations between these two objects. So everything is connected with or by sympathy, a sympathetic vibration. Way back when I began this study, a lady came to me. I was working at the Casey Foundation in Virginia. And this lady came to me and she says, well, how does Christ fit into this physics? I didn't know. That was quite a question. I just didn't know. And I began digging into the Casey material because he talked a lot about Christ and the energies and the patterns and how all that stuff related to each other. And after a while it finally dawned on me how Christ fits into this and what Christ is in regards to a physical universe. And that is, he was the sympathy. He was the love. You know, Casey said he lived the law, he was the law, he personified the law, he taught the law. And I said, what law? You know, I had to dig that out. That was in the book of John. And the book of John explains how Christ was material and then he became spirit, with one with the Father and then one with us and then one with the Spirit. I think it's John 16, something like that. But that was a perfect description of what I just told you a little while ago about how the material realm, the molecular realm can become the high spiritual realm, the mind levels and beyond, and how it can become the molecular again. Does that... Any more questions on that?
Yeah, this is not really a question. It's just a little statement. When you talk about sympathetic vibrations, really what you're talking about is resonance. No.
No, there's a difference between sympathetic vibration and resonance. Resonance is an effect. Sympathetic vibration is the cause of that effect. If we've got this thing vibrating over here, and it has a vibration, it is emitting a vibration that happens to be sympathetic to this one over here, this one will begin to resonate after the sympathetic vibration impacts it. So resonance is an effect, it's not a causative, but it in itself can then become a cause of something else. It's all big chains, everything's hooked together.
Okay, because this is something I've worked on or pondered on my own for a long time, and if you look at all the science, a lot of the effects of science are really caused by, when you're talking about chemistry and how things relate, it's really the vibrations that make all these combinations and molecules possible. And I've been working on this, trying to put together some kind of paper, and it's really an unknown law or principle that's never been published in the books, which is that's sympathetic vibrations. And for some reason, I don't know why it's never in there, but it's so obvious. But it's really a principle, but it's not mentioned. It's not a law like some of these other laws are. And maybe I can talk to you more about that. The reason why it's left out, it's something really obvious. I call it resonance, but I understand. I call when I say resonance, I mean both. What you're saying, the two things.
Well, in the realm that we're trying to investigate here, and I need to go back and reiterate, my original investigation personally, my personal quest, began in my effort to understand. I was living in South America, I was having a hard time with life in general, and I wanted to understand it to an extent that I wasn't a victim of it. I wanted to know more about life and how to deal with it. And as I began studying about cycles, that everything in life operates on cycles, business cycles and whatnot, I began to realize that there's more to this than any of us ever thought. And it's a quest for truth, and it's very difficult to lump things together or to look at something with not as great a precision as we can. We have to look with as great a precision as we can possibly have. So there is a difference between sympathetic vibration and resonance. And we need to understand those differences, or we're just lumping things together and we don't have a clear and accurate viewpoint of what we're trying to do or accomplish. And it took me a long time to be able to say what I just told you very simply, the difference between those two things. Yeah. Things like induction in electrical science. The cause of induction is sympathetic vibration, but they don't look at it like that. If you go to the mechanical engineering books, they talk about sympathetic vibration. The music talks about it. There's sympathetic instruments. They've been designed for the past 200 years. There's all kinds of things. But it hasn't been a big deal. See? And only through the Keely stuff did he really take that thing. And there is a law of sympathetic vibration. I have that on my table in there.
Okay. Have you tried to take that law seems like a fundamental fact of nature. Have you tried to break it down even further, like they, breaking down the molecule into, smaller? Have you tried to look into the more origins of that, or is that something outside this physical plane? That's just the law.
No, there are what I call universal principles. And Casey talked about these quite a bit. Keely dealt with them. All the old philosophers taught about universal principles and laws. Today we don't. Today we learn a technology, and that's what we earn our living with. In the old days, these universal principles applied universally, or they weren't universal principles, they were something else. And there are a given set of these principles that we've identified. Polarity is one, resonance is another, rhythm. These are basic fundamental things, and they apply to all realms, whether it's a molecular realm or an etheric realm, they all apply the same. There will be mode shifts and things of that nature, but it's basically the same stuff. So you only got to learn one thing, and it applies to everything. So yeah, it's there if we care to put forth the effort.
Okay, thank you.
Do you allow me a little bit to go to the chart and explain practical use of those numbers?
If it's not more than a minute.
I will try as fast as possible. Everyone from time to time goes for a symphony concert with a famous piano player like Claiborne and so on. There is only one note which is in tune, orchestra with the piano. People don't realize this. And this is how this is. Now, to explain this one here, if you, let's say this is a contra C, the second C on the piano, on the left side. Once you play this note, all those other numbers are playing at the same time. Generally people don't hear it because they are not in train. I quit to play with the symphony orchestra. I'm still connected with music as a piano tuner. If I play this one here and play, this means contra C. This is octave. The next C flips G. This is seventh. This is 2 octaves, and so on and so on. Now, if you play this note and you press those equivalent notes, but not playing, just press the keys down, and you play this one here loud, you can hear the whole. All the other sounds on the piano. It's very easy to demonstrate. This is true of what you are talking about. All other instruments, they are built completely different from piano. Up to John Sebastian Bach, on a piano you could play only in 3 keys. Let's say C, F, 1 sharp, and one flat, F. John Sebastian Bach was a smart cat. He likes to compose in all the keys. So they call all the piano tuners and they discuss. And this is a time where they introduce so-called temperament tuning, which is not exactly corresponding with this side here. We have to compromise to how does. In other words, I will explain how to understand. For instance, if the violin plays C, half a tone has 9 commas. In Europe, we call commas. I don't know what this equivalent in USA. Also commas? Okay, 9 commas. If violin plays C sharp, he is using 5 commas. In other words, from C sharp to D remains only 4. But if he goes down, he plays D flat, he is again using 5. From D flat to C remains only 4. You see where the conflict is. This is what all choirs are doing without instrument. Choirs are doing this. All symphony orchestras are doing this. Even brass instruments are doing this. Now, to compromise, to use the piano with the orchestra, we are using completely different system of tuning the piano. We call it temperament. And I said at the beginning, there's only one note which corresponds correctly with the symphony orchestra, the A. The violin player plays the A, and all people plays the A on the piano, and all are playing. All other notes are out of tune. Of course, the general public don't hear it because it's so fine, so close. If I go for, let's say, for Clyburn Symphony Orchestra concert with the piano, I have to do this because it interferes with my listening. It's not in tune, but this is the only way to do it.
Okay. Thank you. He made some very good points there that probably went over most people's heads. One thing he said there towards the end, that there is discord in harmony. And there is discord innate, naturally found within harmony. We can play these tones in an orchestra. We got a molecule that's sitting there. This thing is moving. It is spinning, it is oscillating, it is vibrating, it's doing all these things, and motion is caused by discord. And this is a little thing that a lot of these New Age people don't yet realize. When things are in balance, there's no motion. When you bring everything into balance, everything into harmony, there is no motion. That's why when you meditate, you find that still center. You become very, very harmonized, very, very balanced. There is no motion. When you introduce the inharmonic, the male force, bam, you got energy, you got motion, you got activity. So inherent in number. Pythagoras said there was only really one number, and that was 1. Everything else were derivatives of that, and they are subsets. So in one, we have harmony, pure harmony. But because of its natural propensity to mirror itself into its duality, then it breaks out into these other numbers and whatnot, and we get the inharmonic effect from harmony. And he mentioned how commas would go up and they come down in different quantities and whatnot. There is a little thing in there called the Pythagorean comma, which is 81 over 80 parts. And that is inherent in this harmony, because as we go up the scale and we try and come back down, it's not quite the same. There's always this change, 1 part in 81. So what all those things really mean, we've only got so much mind energy to decipher all these things out, but they do play a part. Here's that little tiny piece, and when it comes back down, it gives a little bit nudge not to be the same thing. So life eternally progresses. If they went up and it came back down in the same range, and this is just basic physics. I mean, if everything went up in a higher frequency and came back down the same way they went up, life would be harmonized and there would be no life. Because life is motion, life is activity, life is doing things. Yes, Bob?
Another example of that is the lambdoma that Barbara Hero has reconstructed from the Pythagorean theorems, and she'll be here later to talking about that.
Okay. We're going to diverge here just a little bit, give you a little bit more basic things about vibration. All these basic things I'm giving you are useful. It hardly matters what field you work in. These things aren't useful. If nothing else, they show you and indicate to you that things aren't as simple as they are made out to be sometimes. Every vibration is a complex waveform. There's no such thing as a simple sine wave. A sine wave is composed of a series of synthesized tones in a harmonic gradient to each other. So if you synthesize a bunch of sounds together, they will add together and create a sine wave, like I showed you in the beginning. If we change those aliquot parts, if they weren't these even-numbered harmonics, this would create a sine wave. If you added all these numbers together and created a signal from a signal generator, you would get a sine wave. If we added the inharmonics, such as the 12 and these different other numbers that these things would add and subtract together to create, we could get a sawtooth sound wave. This is a sawtooth. I can't even draw it on there. And it's got these sharp corners to it. It's what's called a sawtooth waveform. Another waveform that engineers know a lot about with computers nowadays is a square wave. This is the digital pulses in a computer. It's all square waves. And then, of course, we got the sine wave. This sine wave is a tone that comes from a clarinet. It is composed of these very harmonic tones. When they add it together, you get a very smooth, even tone sound, like in a flute or a whistle. If we have the inharmonic tones added to it, it'll bend this thing out of shape. It will modulate these frequencies that compose this, that this is composed of, and we'll get these sharp tones. This is like from a cornet or a trumpet. A brass instrument will create sawtooth waves. That's why if you sound a C on a cornet and a C on a trumpet and a C on a piano, you get totally different tones. You get different sounds. But the fundamental C is the same. It is the difference in those small tones added together give you that sound of that particular instrument. They create these various waveforms. And these are just very simplistic. They can get very, very complicated and create these forms. So, in our new engineering that we're doing now, the new sciences, these subtler sciences, you hear a lot about transverse waveforms and longitudinal waveforms and vortexes and all these things. And you say, well, how does all this stuff relate to anything, and what are they, and you know, just what are these people talking about? A vibration, if you throw a pebble in a pond, you're going to see ripples going out from it. But if you look real close, you'll see a lot of things going on at the same time. It's not just ripples, but you got to look very carefully. This is what we're talking about in precision. You got to be precise in what's going on. Yes?
An idea just came into my mind, and I wonder if it's related to this. I have done electroplating, electroforming, and you have the movement, you know, of electrons through the medium that go from, you know, the cathode to the anode. I never remember who is who. Anyway, if there is a jagged form at the cathode where the deposit is supposed to occur, instead of a round form, you are going to have more deposit of the metal on the jagged points than on the smooth form. The same thing happens in the circulatory system. At the aorta or at parts of the arteries where there are jagged forms, you have cholesterol deposits. So I wonder if there is a correlation between the smoothness of a wave and how energy reacts with the smoothness of a wave and the jaggedness of a wave.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a sense of what I'm saying?
Yes, I know what you're saying. That's a very good question. There's a number of things that you're talking about. First and foremost, you're talking about polarity, interaction of polarities versus waveform. Getting back to the waveform first, part of the question is, there's a science developed by, I'll remember his name shortly, it's called Centics. An Australian author developed this, where he measured the waveforms of pressure when people touch one another, especially in healers. And he found that in certain waveforms of pressure, people felt good or they didn't feel good. We get these different reactions from the different waveforms. So yes, waveform does have an effect. Like we were talking about, if you got music that was written for and played by brass instruments, like Sousa marches, you're going to react different than if you heard a bunch of flutes or clarinets playing a melody. So the waveforms impact us differently, and we get different physiological results or emotional results from these different waveforms. Now, the other part of your question is on this polarity business. We know in electrical science that electrical energy will seek out the jagged points and it will avoid hollows. It has, as near as we can figure, and I'll parenthesize this before I get into it over my head, is the subject of polarity is extremely intricate. Anybody who's dealt with another human being of the opposite sex knows how complicated that can get. There's the positive male force seeks those points. Okay, female force is the hollow points, the hollows. They're not points, the hollows. And as a force radiates outward, there is the opposite and equal reaction, as Newton taught us, that attracts to those points. Now, how and why that mechanism particularly does what it does, I do not know. I am constantly thinking about how that works. It's very, very intricate. So, there's two parts to your question. Yeah, Bob?
Yeah, I may be able to shed a little light on that point stuff. When you do a electrostatic plot of that sharp point, you plot the field,
right.
Then the gradient is much more concentrated at that point, at the sharp point. For example, when you have lightning rods, the charge leaks off a sharpened point, etc. So the sharpened points get the attractors. Okay, and that's the simple physics.
Yeah.
Because there's a larger gradient. There's a larger gradient potential difference. There are more force lines coming off of that point than on the sides. More? Okay? So it's a higher gradient coming off the point than it is off the sides. So there are less lines on the sides and more lines to the point, so that's an attractor.
Yeah. There's considerably other factors involved in that tiny little phenomena. For instance, when water evaporates, that spot gets cool. But it has to be warm for the evaporation to take place. So we get an emission or radiation, and then we get the contraction of the lowering of the temperature. So there's a very intricate thing going on here, and we need to spend a lot more time trying to figure it out. Well, this gentleman here has a question, Bob, right in the front row.
Just simply an explanation of the square wave, maybe an instrument comparable instrument to a square wave producing. You had brass for the trombones and clarinet was wood.
A drum is a pulse wave. Percussion is a pulse type deal, where it's kind of like this, only it's more compact and pulled together, right? That would be a percussion. I'm trying to run through my mind. The xylophone keeps coming to mind, but I'm not sure that's accurate.
Well, yeah, in CD players and stuff like that, the reproduction is square wave, and there's a couple articles on how people don't feel as harmonic with that after it has been produced that way.
There's why
subconsciously.
Right. There's two reasons why that takes place. Probably a whole lot more too. I know of. First place in digital sampling, when they sample the music and put it on the discs. The sampling technique is the microphone or the sensing device will listen to the music and then stop, and listen to the music and stop, and listen to the music and stop. So that's sampling, and so many times a second. Generally, it's around, I think, 30,000 times a second. Well, what happens between those samplings is lost. But because our ears only react so quickly, we don't really hear that, but people who are trained in music, who are very sensitive, can pick that up, and it is not correct music. So the digitally reproduced music is not analog, it's digital, and all those high harmonics, like we're talking here, we go up into the high harmonics, even though we aren't aware that we hear them, our body reacts to those. So if a computer samples it and leaves those out, we don't get that. See, we don't get that at all. It's not there. And the other factor is the square wave, as we were saying, it's aliquot constructs that create it for what it is. It doesn't have all the other components. So all digital, or nearly all of it, is done with square waves. So there again, we've got a distortion of what the natural phenomena is. And we've got an artificial phenomenon. So computer music is artificial, period. Yeah, so getting back to this triune waveform. Longitudinal wave is a wave that goes out away from its source. It's going straight out away from its source. So we've got, in this particular design, the longitudinal is up and down. So it's straight out, and going the backwards too, the same thing. But it goes out and it comes back, out and it comes back. That's one direction. The transverse or shear wave, a lot of these vibrations have different names. These are the technical scientific terms. The transverse or shear wave is 90 degrees to that. So as longitudinal goes out, the transverse is like this. It goes out on this plane. And we can say longitudinal goes up and down like I'm standing, and longitudinal is up and down, and the transverse is on this plane. So if I rotate it, it'd still be on this plane. That's the transverse going out. That's the ripples on the water. Okay? The Raleigh wave, now all these things are 90 degrees to each other. So we've got one up and down, and one this way is 90 degrees to the first. The Raleigh wave is 90 degrees to those, and it spins like this. It rotates. It has a curvilinear momentum to it. And it may be a result of the first two adding together in some sort of way to create this vortexian motion. So we get a tornado going or a hurricane, we have evidence of all three vibrations going on at the same time. And Keely made these motors, these negative attractive things. One of the most amazing things he ever made was what he called his musical sphere. And there are these big brass and copper spheres. He made some out of glass. I think his original first ones were made out of glass. And he would play a tune on his harmonica or whatever, and these things would start to spin. He understood this triune mechanism of the vibrations. Once the thing got to spinning, it would spin faster and faster and faster until the thing would destruct itself. But he would play a different tone and disrupt that chord of vibrations going on inside the sphere, and it would stop. And he always liked to hand somebody one of these spheres when they came in, and he'd get it to spinning, and it would go so fast these people would be terrified holding this thing. And he would eventually, he would act like he couldn't get it stopped, see, and then he would eventually stop it. But those musical spheres, I've been real curious about how and why they work. I've got 3 different experiments I've done that cause rotation that conventional science, to my knowledge, does not explain what's happening. And I want to understand rotation. Keely left us a chart and on what causes rotation. It's a musical chart. It's full of musical notations and whatnot. We don't yet understand that. But in these 3 experiments, one was done with a radiometer. And a radiometer is just a small little, looks like a light bulb, and you put it in a light on your windowsill and the thing will spin. Looks like a little windmill. Conventional engineering has about 6 different definitions of why that does what it does. And I think they're all wrong, because if they were right, we'd only have one explanation. And Keely said that if you vibrate an atomic substance with an atomic vibration, you get rotation. This was the first experiment I did to prove to myself that Keely was not bogus, and I wasn't going to waste the rest of my life working with him. And I said, okay, well, let's do this experiment. So I had a radiometer, and most people don't realize this, but a radiometer has argon gas in it. If you take the argon gas out, it won't rotate. So the argon gas, to my interpretation of Keely's work, is an atomic substance. It's not a molecule, it's not a complex atom, it is an atom of argon. In this case, a lot of them. And the only source of vibration I had to me at the time was my microwave oven. So I just took this radiometer and put it in my microwave and turned it on. And I'll tell you something. If you want to be excited, you try it. This thing, the bulb itself began to flash. Brilliant white flashes like you see on flash bulbs on cameras. This thing will flash so brilliant it'll blind you. And then this thing started to spin, but it didn't just start to spin. It span so fast you couldn't You couldn't see it. It just became a blur, just like that, instant. But you got to be careful. If you leave it in there more than 3 or 4 seconds, the needle that suspends the little windmill turns red hot, white hot, and it melts right through the little glass thing. So in 5 seconds, it costs you $10. That's about what those things cost. So you just want to run it 3 or 4 seconds and see this thing. It is absolutely incredible. And that taught me 2 things. One is conventional engineering knows nothing about what causes those things to do what they do. They don't know anything about it. And 2, Keely knew. Unless it was just a bunch of circumstances that happily resulted in all this motion and activity going on in this microwave. Another experiment I had, and I brought it with me. It's over here on the table, and I'll show it to anybody who wants to see it. We took a armature from an electric motor, and we stripped all the copper wire off of it. There's no magnets on it. We put 2 bearings on the shaft, and if you attach a DC current to either side of this armature and give it a little nudge, this thing will start to spin, and it will accelerate until it flies apart, but it gets too hot for that. We disconnect it in 4 or 5 seconds. These things are very fast. It's incredible. And I took it to the conference in Denver a few months ago where all these electrical engineers, all the foremost people in the world, and not one of them could tell me how it did what it did. We since found out that DC current is not really DC current. It is an oscillating current or an alternating current that has a frequency beyond the gamma range. So to all intents and purposes, it is a DC current. But in actuality, here again, we get in our precision, it is an alternating current. And it has to be an alternating current or that thing wouldn't spin. I know that much about it. We have to have positive and negative forces going on or we don't get the Raleigh wave, the Lamb wave going around in circles. Another question here?
I have either read or seen something in the 40s where they had 2 counter-rotating fields, and I don't know how they did this. They made a spacecraft, somebody did this, and it would disappear, and he could fly around, be conscious inside and see, but he would not be able to be seen outside. And they did this in New Mexico, I believe, and went 30, 40 miles back and forth in a few seconds. So some of this, when it gets going that fast, just becomes unable for us to see, I think, is part of it, without this, if the material doesn't destroy itself.
Yeah.
So I don't know about the counter fields, how they did that. They were going in different directions. So that DC would be negative and positive in that case.
Right. That's a very good question. I've never heard of that particular instance either, but it brings up another aspect of this physics. If we could maintain the algorithm, Henry was talking about how the fractal resemblance of this molecule exists. If we could maintain that mathematical algorithm, maintain its integrity, and we could increase the velocity of spin on this molecule, it would shrink. It would pop to the next size smaller instantly. That's a quantum leap of quantum physics, by the way. When the energy increases or decreases, we get this release or condensation of energy. If we could do that, this thing would shrink into a subatomic particle level, maintaining its integrity, and guess what? You would be invisible. Now, if you could slow it all down all at the same time, it's like a computer program. If you slow it down all the time, all of a sudden it would pop back into visibility. Pop? Invisible. Nonsensible.
That's how you can explain a teleportation of objects.
Right.
Because in a teleportation of objects, the visible object has to shrink to the point that it becomes invisible, and then obviously it decelerates and it becomes visible again.
Pretty much the same, yeah. It's kind of like a Star Trek thing where they transport people. I don't think it's feasible that we could ever disassociate an individual and then reassociate, maybe, who knows what's happening next year. But if we could maintain that mathematical integrity of it, it would be fairly a simplistic thing, much simpler. That, by the way, that kind of idea may explain some of this UFO type stuff we've been hearing about. If they could maintain that integrity and shrink to that energy level, all of a sudden velocity of propagation becomes infinite. They could cruise the universe in minutes.
Yeah, but teleportation phenomena have been observed all the time. I mean, I have observed them, I experienced them myself. So this is not just theory. This is, experiential reality.
Teleportation is a little bit different in that the gravitic component. Here we get back to another whole aspect of this science. Keely maintained that gravity, magnetism, and electricity were intimately intertwined with each other. Just as I showed the picture of the vibration, these charts, I gotta make a statement here. These charts, I keep using the same chart over and over and over again, and I keep using, as I talk about one, I talk about the other. And this is a holistic science. It's not just take this one thing and this is what it's all about. It takes a certain amount of time and energy to study all these different little things, and then all of a sudden you get the picture. And it is real simple, and you just got to keep going over it and going over it and going over it. This gets back to, we're going to start with the sun to explain this thing about electricity, magnetism, and gravity. The sun heats the earth, they tell us, and the sun lights the earth, they tell us. And then they say, well, if you want to maintain a refrigerated area, you need vacuum as the best insulator against heat. And then they say there's 93 million miles of vacuum between the sun and us. And I say, well, something's not right here if the heat can come from the sun to the earth through all that vacuum. And there really is no physics to explain that. One guy will label it, and he'll say, well, it's radiation that heats the earth. Well, a label doesn't explain anything. All it does is tags it. It's like saying an apple falls to the ground because of gravity. That doesn't explain what's happening. And radiation doesn't explain what's happening in this particular case. Keely had an explanation for this. If there was heat coming from the sun and light coming from the sun as heat and light, interplanetary space would be full of light and it would be hot. And it isn't. It's cold and it's dark.
Before we go into that, we're going to have to change tapes. Could we take about a 5-minute break?
Fine. 5-minute break. On the screen, the three fundamental modes of any vibration: longitudinal, transverse being 90 degrees, and then a Raleigh wave rotating at 90 degrees to those two. You can't have one without the other two. It's physically impossible. They are intertwined components, one within the other. In the electromagnetic scale of forces, if you start at 1 hertz down here and you double your frequency every octave on up, as you go through the octaves, I believe it's at the 21st octave you get a mode shift. So it goes from predominance to the longitudinal to the predominance to the transverse. And then as you go higher than that, the predominance changes again, probably to the Raleigh. Keely alluded to these shifts in modes according to frequency, but we haven't had them verified yet. But I believe they are there. That would describe in part the difference between sound that we hear and light that we see. Moving along, part of that, what brought this up was how the sun can heat the earth through 93 million miles of vacuum. Keely maintained that a force called the polar forces, the celestial triune forces coming from the sun, are balanced in a harmonic fashion. In other words, they're intertwined together concordantly, just as you would a rope that has 3 braids to it. You twist this rope together and you can't see any of the 3 braids until you twist this rope backwards. And then you can start to see the 3 modes of vibration inherent in the one mode, the one vibration. And accordingly, this is kind of like the scalar stuff that you're hearing about now, where you have a potential, but you don't have anything evident. You can't see it. You can't measure it, but it's there. You got all this potential. Well, as this energy travels from the sun, intertwined together harmonically, as it is balanced, as we talked before, there is no manifestation of this energy. When you're in balance, when you're in harmony, there is no outer manifestation. You can't sense it, you can't measure it, you can't do anything with it, but it is there. And that's another answer to some of the subtle energy business. Energy is all around us in infinite quantities, but it is harmonically bound together in a triune polar flow. Now, if we take a generator that is composed primarily of magnets, now you got a bunch of copper wire in them, and you twist the magnetic currents against each other, you're going to split this triune flow apart. And if we're real clever, we'll put two little copper wires down each side, and the electrical current will rush down these wires. But it will only rush down those wires if it can see a place where it can get back together where it came from. So the spark at the end of a wire is not electricity that's been generated. It's electricity that's trying to get back to where it came from. It seeks that place of balance. It will always seek that place of balance. And the spark is the energy going back into a state of balance where it disappears again. So it's not used up. It just gets infolded. It becomes re-emerged where it came from. So if we got this energy streaming from the sun, it is of a given frequency component, frequency range, a waveform. When it strikes a molecule or an atom, which is vibrating, the atom and molecules vibrate at different frequencies. Those frequencies combine with the frequencies of the radiant energy from the sun and demodulates it to a lower frequency range to where we can see it. It splits it apart. That is called refraction. That's why you can't see light. You can see me and I can see you, but you can't see anything between us. You can't see light. So that's the undifferentiated light of the ancients. That's the undifferentiated whole white light. When it strikes a molecule or an atom, it refracts, splits it into various subtle ranges of frequencies, and then we get to rainbow. And that explains how all that stuff happened. So we've got this current coming from the sun. Keely said it was magnetic, electrical, and gravity, or gravitic, as he called it. And this, I got a chart here. These rays from the sun are called actinic rays. It's an ancient term. It was used quite predominantly in the 1800s because these guys were all investigating the whys and wherefores. A funny thing about spheres will focalize impacting energy to their centers. People will do the same thing. If we think of people as centralized vibrating forces, we tend to absorb things that impact to us, whether it's a sound or somebody speaking or whatever. We tend to bring it to ourselves. We'll take that into ourselves eternally, like a piece of knowledge, like I'm conveying to you, and then you chew it up or whatever, and then you'll re-radiate it back out to somebody else. You'll tell them about different things that you learned. So the sun and the planets all do the same thing, only they do it just a little bit different. So the energy radiating from the sun, first it picks it up from the grand central sun of the universe, and then it'll contract it to itself, focalize it to its center, and then re-radiate it back out to the Earth, and then the Earth will do that again, and each molecule on the Earth does the same thing. Now there is a law in philosophical physics, the natural philosophy of the 1800s, to which Keely said was the one fundamental law in the universe, to which all other laws are subservient. And it's called the law of assimilation, the cosmical law of assimilation. And that's what you're seeing in operation here. The contracting inward, the focalizing, the bringing inward, and then the re-radiating back out. Everything else is subservient to that phenomenon. So we have centers, infinitely tiny centers, which aren't really there materially speaking, but it is about these centers which coalesce or form or aggregate these other forces and become an integral unit of itself. So that's where each one of us humans are too. The neutral center of us is our soul. evidence through the solar plexus, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In the martial arts, they teach us that's where the center is, and we try and centralize our forces, our attention, our will, and become very quiet and very still. The natural attributes of that neutral center is that, quietness. So the center volume of any given sphere or entity is 1/3 of the volume of that sphere is a neutral zone. On the outer side, we got the peripheral forces, as we spoke before. The male forces, the radiating forces, tend to seek the outside peripheral of it, and the female forces towards the centers. Without the neutral center in there, male and female forces, the positive and negative forces, cannot associate properly. I'll give you a perfect example analogy in human activity, and I really like this analogy. It's really kind of neat. We've all seen couples ice skating, especially in the Olympics. It's a very, very beautiful sight. Here's a male and female, man and woman, doing an extraordinarily beautiful, harmonious thing. So we've got the male and the female acting in concert to create a concordant, harmonious spectacle. The neutral is etheric. The neutral is their ideal. What is it they are trying to attain? If they have the same ideal, the same etheric, neutral governing principle, then you've got this concordance, this harmony of motion and activity. It's when that ideal is lost that you got some of the problems we see today. They don't have a common ideal. So the neutral is both positive and negative. It can be either. It can become predominantly positive, predominantly male, or vice versa, female. So the neutral can become both. And yet it is one of the greatest enigmas of this Keely stuff. What exactly is this neutral thing? So we've got the energy coming in from the sun, attracted towards the center of the earth, going into this neutral zone and being converted. It's like platinum does in the chemical industry. Platinum converts elements from one to another, and yet it itself remains the same, unchanged. This is starting to sound like the old philosopher's stone of the ancient times. So the platinum embodies the neutral forces, the neutral force, or the neutral condition, I think we'd rather say. And in the old books, like Genesis, for instance, if we look at Genesis from a vibratory standpoint, it becomes like a tech manual. It says how the etheric, the infinite energy levels, the void, remember how we talked about all the energy was in the void, there was God, that was everything, is held latent in that void. And how that became demodulated lower and lower and lower frequencies by stages, as it would be in music, to become male and female forces, and then the neutral force, which would be God in the center of Adam and Eve. And it's kind of neat when you start looking at some of this ancient literature from these fundamental universal principles. Those guys knew what they were talking about. But if you transport yourself back 2,000 years ago, there was no English word for vibration. There was no English word for electricity or any of these things. So they had to convey it to us in allegorical form or metaphors or whatever to get the essence or the insight to what they were trying to tell us. And the Masons had it, and the Rosicrucians had it, and the Indians, Vedas, and all those people had all this stuff. And all we're doing is rediscovering something that's been there all this time. Are there any questions? Somebody had a question about water.
Yeah, I was reading some Keely material, and it mentioned an interesting experiment where you take a sound vibration of around 40,000 cycles per second, which you could generate, say, by a piezo ceramic disc, and put it in or near a cup of water. It'll start to vibrate, and if you increase the power enough, it'll turn into pure energy. Could you explain something about that?
Sure, yeah. In some of this literature that we have, it's reported that John Keely, like in this particular motor, he could take water and vibrate it at a given frequency, and it would disassociate the water. Well, that's kind of neat. In one of the articles, it mentions that he found that the frequency of 42,800 cycles per second would be sufficient to disassociate water. Disassociate means break water into water vapor. So you break the large molecule of water into smaller molecules of water vapor. In my effort to figure out exactly what was going on, and this was back in the beginning, I don't think he used a pure mechanical vibration. You're talking about piezoelectric. Yeah, that works. If you can go down to Walmart or Kmart and you can buy an ultrasonic humidifier. Here is sound in the high frequency ranges breaking water into water vapor. And you can buy it off the shelf today. 100 years ago, there was no knowledge of ultrasonics. Ultrasonics didn't become a subject until the 30s, 1930s, 50 years after Keely did his work. In my own effort, I have not been able to convince myself that 42,800 is a significant frequency, except maybe if we could take water and pulsate it, as this motor does. Just take the whole volume of water and start to do this to it, 42,800 times a second. I think we would see a dramatic disassociation of that water. If you could pull a vacuum on it that fast and compress it that quickly, this thing would actually explode. I'm pretty sure that's what would happen. Now, I did take an ultrasonic humidifier apart, and I pulled out the piezoelectric device, and we tried to do an analysis on the frequencies coming out of this thing so we could, get some idea of what was going on. The only piezoelectric transducers, little crystals. There's a lot of talk about crystals around here, but technically speaking, we got this little crystal, barium titanate usually. If you put a current into it, it will expand or contract. And so you put a current in there the many times you want it to expand and contract, and this thing will do it. However, it creates many, 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 many modes of vibration. There are many frequencies coming out of this transducer. So we need to identify the fundamental. We were not able, with the crummy equipment we had, to identify the fundamental of this crystal. And I also understand that as the frequencies change, use higher or lower frequencies, you get different fundamentals and you get different modes. So we were not able to analyze this crystal. We did learn, however, that they were using a lot of power. They were putting a lot of power through this crystal. And if you look at some of Keely's stuff, he didn't use power like that. Where we use power today with the old sledgehammer nail approach, let's just put more power in it to get an effect. He used art, and he tuned these machines as though they were musical instruments, which is what they were. He would fine-tune every component, every piece of the machine until it sounded as though it were a musical instrument. And then he could zero in on these various frequencies. So whatever the chord was that disassociated water, he built that into his machines, and he could just sound a harmonica or whatever, and bingo, he would have all this etheric vapor. That, by the way, if you go from solid or liquid or water, which is large molecules, down to water vapor, which is smaller molecules, and then you break that down, you get into Keely's etheric vapor. And this etheric vapor has extraordinary properties. And that's how he derived from it. That is how he created his etheric vapors. It was through this sound operating on water. And he took it down 8 levels. If anyone could replicate those types of experiments and get that etheric vapor to where they could use it, I think we would find a revolution in our technology today. And a veritable revolution in what we could do. I have a question in the back.
Yes. Have you seen Andrija Puharich's paper on using these methods to disassociate water for fuel?
Yes, I have. Puharich, quite a character, this Andrija Puharich. He designed and patented and built an acoustic disassociating device that was made of special ceramic material. They put water into it. I don't know exactly how it all worked. This water would disassociate to the hydrogen-oxygen level, and he made an attempt to use the hydrogen as a fuel. It was hydrogen on-demand device. Quite extraordinary. This was 12, 15 years ago that he did this. I don't think anything ever became of it. I think someone could probably dig that out and really do something with it. Do you have a question?
It sounds like there might be some correlation with what's going on here and what Hahnemann did to get the homeopathic remedies to be as vital as they were when there was less and less of what there was. Is it when, do you know?
Yeah, good question. Really good question. I got to say something first. This stuff is so simple. You know, we tend to confuse everything. That's what we want to do. If it's not difficult and hard to understand, there's probably nothing to it. That's what they teach us in school. The higher you go in your grades, the tougher it gets, and then you get your degree because you went through all this agony to learn this thing that you can charge money for it. I don't think that's correct. I don't think it's true at all. I think it's exactly the opposite. If we could simplify and we could see clearly with our hearts, then all the stuff becomes real simple. And it's so simple. You meet these people, practitioners of these various things like homeopathy and the hands and all this kind of stuff, and you say, where's the technology? Where's the science? And yet they're curing people right and left. We're creating major effects in people's lives. This question that she has about homeopathic function, what's going on in this room is a perfect demonstration of the homeopathic phenomena. You guys are a bunch of molecules in the water. I am a single molecule of something else. And I'm emitting or radiating a given frequency, range, or component, or complex of information to you. When we break up and we go out in the halls and you return to your lives and I return to mine, you're all going to have a piece of what I gave you, and you're going to resonate to that. Some of you are going to take it to levels I never dreamed of. Some of you are going to take it into fields I never thought about or didn't have time or couldn't get into. And that's the basic principle behind it. It's a sympathetic transmission of like to like, and it evokes a response in the so-called isolated system. That's what's happening here, only on a much higher level. This is happening on the etheric and mind level. So the homeopathic thing is just that, and nothing more than that. It's very, very, very simple. Did that answer your question? I can't see. I got this light here in my face. Two other things here. We get back to the basic principle. Difference between a vibration and an oscillation. Vibration is the movement of an atom within inside itself. It's like the subatomic particles that compose an atom are vibrating. That's the vibration of the atom. But the atom may be oscillating, bouncing into other atoms. That's an oscillation. It's like people dancing. Inside they got this real neat vibration, and the outer manifestation of it is the oscillation. So they are different. They are fundamentally different. We got any more questions on some of this?
Are you familiar with the work of Rudolf Steiner?
Yes.
Because Steiner, I guess through clairvoyant insights, whatever, or also natural observation, arrived to the conclusion that the life force expresses its flow in vortexes. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if you could correlate that to Keely, if there was an analogy somehow.
Yes, there is. Keely made a statement to the same effect. He said all force manifests in vortex motion. And at first glimpse, when you first look at that statement, you say, well, that's absurd because lasers don't vortex and all this other kind of stuff. And you got to remember that the information we have on Keely is scraps, bits and pieces that we found in newspaper articles, magazine articles. And so we got to take these little scraps and use a little bit of deduction and whatnot and try and figure out in what context was this thing said. And I think that the answer to that goes back to this original drawing. That we can't have any vibration without all three modes. And if that's the case, then he's correct. Now, we can't have any manifestation of any kind of energy unless we got the vortex at the same time. So we may have a radiant type phenomena going on, but it's going to cause a rotation. And I've got another thing here that shows how the rotation can come about. This reflects wave motion in water. If you had a stick sitting on the water and the water is got a wave motion in the water, the stick doesn't go anywhere. It just goes up and down, up and down, up and down. The same thing with the atom or the molecules of the water itself. It looks like the molecules of the water are moving along with the wave front, but that's not true. The molecules of the water are actually rotating. So here we've got a polarization effect causing rotation again. When we've got compression on the water, we get a rise in the water altitude, which is the wave that we see, but right next to it we have a decrease in the pressure, which is the trough of the wave. So we've got positive and negative forces combining together to create rotation of the particles that make the water up. So that's about the best I can do with that statement. Yeah, Steiner also went on to say in 1913, in a previously unpublished lecture that they translated just recently, a few years ago, that the science of the future would be based on sympathetic vibration. So he was very well aware of Keely's work at that time. This is just to demonstrate some of the modern morphology ideas on how the molecules and atoms are put together. The molecules made of atoms are made of electrons are made of photons, and photons are made out of quarks. That's exactly Keely's definition. 20 years before they admitted an electron existed.
So would you say that Keely was clairvoyant?
He was definitely exceedingly very clairvoyant. I mean, how else would this man or any man get the knowledge that he had? There's just no explanation for it. He took a little bit of science, a little bit of mathematics, and he far exceeded anything we can even dream of today, much less do it. We're just struggling. We're just struggling along. Any more questions on some things? Getting back to the mind control machines, I want to be skipping around now because I kind of losing my place here a little bit. Mind control machines. We've got radionic machines that are nothing other than drawings on a piece of paper, and we can get effects from these devices. What's going on? You know, how can we treat a photograph and have an effect take place miles away from the source? You know, what's the principle here? What's happening? If we go back to what Keely was saying about the brain being an acoustic resonator. Now, acoustics, a sound wave isn't just something we can hear. A sound wave can exist at any frequency. A sound wave is a compression wave, okay, compression rarefaction. So we can go up to these infinitely high levels of frequencies, in the gamma range frequencies, light frequencies, and we still maintain compression rarefaction with many, very exceedingly high frequencies. The brain, the physical gray matter of the brain with its convolutions and its really neat shape that it has, if we look at it as an acoustic resonator, we say, okay, well, we got this thing, and every brain is different. It's physically different. Each brain, therefore, would have a unique collection of frequencies associated with it. So if we could write those down, we would write them as a musical notation. So the frequency is not really that important, but we would have a unique collection of notes that this particular brain that we're looking at would resonate to and vibrate to. Now, when we look at numbers, like if we look at this number 16, now this is a little bit, I want to give you a little exercise here. All this is two squiggles on a piece of paper. I made one squiggle down and one that's got a curlicue on it. If we weren't previously conditioned to read this as 16, what would we see? We would see two squiggles. That's all we would see. It would mean nothing to us. If you can set yourself aside from your previous conditioning and look at that as a symbol, this is a symbol. When we perceive it with our minds, with our eye and into our mind's eye, certain parts of the brain are activated. Certain parts of the brain are excited in a certain way because of the particular configuration that this is. If we saw this squiggle down here, we would get a different type of excitement. A different thing would take place within the physical brain. So when Keely made his machinery, and he could go over to the wall and draw a symbol on the wall and have the motor start, what he was doing was exciting those particular places within the brain to emit a particular chord of frequencies. It's like tuning a radio or sounding a trumpet or any other kind of acoustical device. If you excite that device, you're going to get a certain particular chord of frequencies. And if his motor was tuned to those frequencies, it would react. That's why our bodies react the way they react. According to Keely's philosophy, it is the etheric currents going through the body on these high levels, in tune with the aspects, with the pieces and the materiality that is our hand. We have that sympathetic connection, so there's a sympathetic stream of vibrations going down through the materiality of your body. And if you happen to be holding a spoon just right, it will do what you want it to do. So we have this connection. There is this innate connection between the brain and the mind and the etheric currents and the materiality of the realm that we live in. Question over here.
How can you consciously tune into that vibration as far as with your mind and other objects? I mean, from my studies, I understand that one, there has to be a sincerity from a positive standpoint, or will be very limited. But how can you fine-tune yourself to that level?
Okay. Keep going back to this chart. That chart and this other chart are absolutely fundamental to understanding this. Earlier we showed how mind is a particle. Mind energy is this realm of superfine particles, energetic particles, that pervade the entire universe. So that is the mind field, if you want to call it that. And our brains, as resonators, are also transducers through the endocrine system, the chakra system, to transduce the lower energies to these higher levels of energies. Through this, what I call the Jacob's ladder, you go down the real low frequencies of the brain, up through the really high frequencies of the mind. Okay, so there's this ladder going up and down. If this is true, if all matter is permeated with mind, and ultimately that's what it's composed of, is mind, then we are mind. And by tuning in our brain, and the way we would do that, we kind of hit along this a little bit earlier, by bringing the body, the mind, the emotions into a state of quietness. Because we just got done saying that the inharmonic, the discordance, is what causes motion. And the will, in my viewpoint, studying all this, the will is the most inharmonic force in the universe. The will causes motion and activity. We think we want to get up and go do something, we get up and go do it. We will to do things, we cause things to happen. So you quiet the will, you quiet the mind, you quiet the body, breathe in and out slowly, and you build that peace and quiet within yourself, allowing the inharmonic currents, the inharmonic effects, to just subside. You know, don't push them, don't force them, because that in itself is inharmonic. So you just allow the harmony to come forth, to grow and to become one with your neutral center, which is your soul. Because The synonym for sympathy is as one. So when things are sympathetic, they are as one. They are in love. They're the same, one and the same. So when you become as one with that neutral center, then that's when the cosmic illumination happens. That's when you see all these things, the brilliant lights and the tremendous inflow of information by becoming one with. Does that make sense?
When I used to think about becoming in one with a certain object or a thing, like an animal, I used to think when you're talking about not using your will or your brain, I used to think at that animal, and now I think with that animal, because it is being coercive to those elements when you're trying to do any kind of a control thing. It's the same thing with seeing auras. The more you think about it, the less you can see it oftentimes. Where if you let go, you can't always see it, but it will start to come in. So I can understand exactly what you're saying.
Yeah.
Or let go, let God, or whatever it might be.
Become one with. There's a good analogy in spoon bending. Some guy came over to the house one day and he was bending spoons, and we got all interested in it and pursued that a little bit. And if you haven't learned how to bend a spoon and actually done it, do it. It is one of the most amazing experiences you can have. In the olden days, and anything that happened before today is the olden days, we considered mind over matter. You know, we could do telekinesis and all that stuff, mind over matter. Well, that's the male approach. Take the female approach. It's mind in matter. That's the difference. Because if you can use your Zen approach like you're talking, and just approach these things and allow the mind to flow and become one with this spoon or whatever it is you're dealing with, it'll do what you want. Because while you're doing that, you're asking permission to approach it, you're asking permission to associate with it, you know, that type of mental attitude. And that's the way it works. It's really neat. So the connecting link is these higher levels. You go up the Jacob's ladder to these infinitely high levels, you can cross over. Once you reach that mind level, the 8th level, everything is connected to everything else. And the connection is mind. It's not, you know, it's nothing other than mind. And mind and sympathy, or sympathetic flows of the mind entity, what is that but love? Everything in the universe is connected by love, through love, with love. And once you've done that, when you become one with this spoon, and it bends for you, you get this I get this tremendously giggly feeling. It's like the laughing Buddha or something. You get this incredible joy. Not that you're bending the spoon, but because you're experiencing oneness with something other than yourself. It's really neat. It's a really neat experience. If you haven't learned it, try it until you get it, because it's really something neat. Some of the other things, we'll go into basic principles of music here a little bit. You don't need a whole lot. It's not going to be very difficult. First and foremost is relativity. Not Einstein's relativity, although he was touching all over this thing, but relativity meaning one thing has a value as opposed to another thing having another value. Each individual is a sacred individual, integral unto themselves. And this is part of what's wrong with society. We treat everybody as numbers, but they're not numbers. You know, a leaf on a tree is a whole leaf. It was created as a leaf. That leaf has substance, has existence, and it has a certain amount of sacredness that it was created by, these forces. So it may be smaller or slightly deformed or whatever, but it is still a leaf, integral unto itself. Each of us are the same ways. We can't lump people together. If we've got a musical note, let's say that's C, which I think it is, not being an expert in music. In Pythagorean scale, this can be either 256 or 512, whatever you want it to be. It doesn't matter. But in a Pythagorean scale, this is considered, we'll just call it 512. Okay? That's the frequency or cycles per second of this musical note. If we go up to the next octave of it, that doubles the frequency. If we've got other notes here and anywhere along here, I don't have them at the tip of my tongue, so it doesn't matter. This is kind of like an algebra shorthand. Most of us in this room know something about algebra. You say A equals 512 and 2A equals 1024. It's that simple. So no matter what we do to these numbers, the relationship stays the same. A is, or in this case, C is always C, D is always D, or F and G are always F and G. And what constitutes those as notes is their ratio, one to another. So a ratio would be so we've got, if we divided this out, it would be 2 to 1, and it's always expressed like this. So the ratios are always exact. And a real good example of this, might not be that good, but an example of this is the number for pi. Back in the old days, in fact, even to this day, the Masons teach about this thing called squaring the circle. And it's a mathematical problem. People try and deal with it. How can you square a circle? All the mathematicians who've looked at it say you can't square the circle. It is not physically possible to do that. However, that's because they're comparing apples and oranges, is why they can't do it. The circumference is not the same thing as a radius. And you can't divide one into the other because they're not the same thing. They're two different things. And we found out that in the 1860s, a man named John Parker, a mathematician, squared the circle, wrote a book on it called Quadrature of the Circle. And it's an extraordinary work. We've republished it. An engineer friend of mine took that book and rewrote it so that we could all understand it, what was going on. And we found out that the value for pi is wrong in the 6th decimal place. You start digging around this old science books and you start finding out a lot of stuff we accept as truth just might not be exactly what we think it is. I might have these numbers a little bit messed up. I think that's the right ratio, but I have to look it up. These are the numbers we came out with. Circumference is this many parts and radius is this many parts. If you divide that into that, you get pi, but it's a little bit different beginning in the 6th decimal place. And as you square the circle and you work with these numbers, you're always working with whole numbers. You cannot work with decimals. Decimals, if there was ever a Satan on this earth, he brought decimals down to us. I think it was the French and Napoleon, actually, who did that. But if you maintain whole numbers in ratios, you can't go wrong because there are whole leaves. There aren't fractions of leaves. There's no such thing as a 0.9 pregnancy. You're either or you're not. Same thing with circles. A circumference is a circumference, and a radius is a radius, and the two can't be divided into each other. They're opposites to each other. Maintain this as the ratio. So ratios are everything. So you get down into this, you say, well, if a frequency was the tooth on a comb, and the interval between the notes was the space between the teeth, which is more important, the teeth on the comb or the space between the teeth, which doesn't really exist. And you got to say that they both have to be there or you have neither. It's like two sides of a coin. So we've got the male vibration radiating going out, and we've got the female space in between them that holds it together, gives it range and definition. And these things are analogous to human life. You just think about it a little bit. They all fit. So we've got to maintain a ratio and relativity. So we can change this number to anything we want. Doesn't matter. Because as long as we maintain a ratio, 2 to 1 in this case, then no matter what that is, it's always half, and that's always twice of that. And the other notes are always the same. It's 3 to 4 and 5 to 6, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, when you get into music. But the basic thing you want to understand is, like some guys used to say, well, what frequency breaks down water? I say, well, it's not that simple. Because we don't know what he was vibrating. And that's all important because of the multiple waveforms that are created in any given vibrating thing. So we go back to this, keeping in mind the thing of relativity. So it doesn't matter what this fundamental tone is. This is your fundamental. As long as you maintain these ratios and numbers, they will always stay the same in relation to each other. It doesn't matter. It does not matter. Any questions on that? Relativity and say something about Einstein. I don't really know what happened in those days, but Einstein published his paper in 1905, I think it was. If you go back in the old literature, the old scientific literature, you'll see direct references to the theory of relativity in the 1860s and the 1870s. And all that Einstein did was apparently read these old books, rewrote it into a form that was conventional for 1905, and then he got a lot of press. They didn't accept him anyway for 30 years. So, and I found that in my research, if you want to know what's going on, and if you really want to understand physics or music or sound or any of this stuff, you got to go prior to 1900. Somehow or for some reason, the books and the subjects that were written about since the 1900s do not contain this old stuff. You have to go back to 1895 and previous. Those guys did extraordinary work, absolutely mind-boggling research what they did. Tyndall and Helmholtz and Keely and Tesla, that's when they did all the great work. Something happened, 1895, 1900, that gave us all this garbage that we have today. You got to go back to the basic principles and the basic science in the early days. That's why on my book table you'll find reprints of a lot of these old books. The ones I found to be valuable, I've tried to reprint them to make them available so you don't have to spend years finding them like I did. And I also took some of these things I'm telling you and rewrote them into a simpler manual, and I call it Sympathetic Vibratory Physics Level 1, which are these basic principles, because there is no book that contains them that I've found in such a form that we can understand them today in today's terminology. There was another little thing. To give you a prime example, in this old literature I kept running into references to positive, and negative, negative vibrations. And what are these people talking about? And, you know, a positive vibration radiates out and a negative contracts to the center. And one day I was fiddling around with pendulums and I figured it out, and it's really simple. And you got to keep this in mind when you're reading this old literature. If we take a pendulum and it swings out, we're going to divide this thing. This side over here is positive and this side over here is negative. The principle of duality has to be preserved in everything that we do. So when it swings out this way, it's a positive stroke on the positive side. So this is a positive phase. So we'll just put P in here instead of writing it all out. When it starts to stroke back, this is a positive negative phase. Coming over here, we've got a negative positive because it's on the negative side, moving outward, radiating outward. And then when it goes back in, we've got the negative phase. So these old guys, not all of them did this because they varied. Some did it different. When they said 42,800, they were probably saying 84,400. Because to them, this pendulum swing, which we regard today as a single vibration, was two vibrations. And when you think about it, when it expands out and contracts as a vibration, expands and contracts, that's one vibration. Only it's the opposite phase of the next vibration, which expands out and contracts this way. So it's really neat. These guys had a beautiful inherent insight into some of these things in the old days. But we've become so simplistic in our technology that, you know, we hit or miss it. We got lots of power and energy. We can put lots of energy in a system and make it do what we want. But in those days, they didn't have that. They had to use art. And when you're building a musical instrument, you got to use art to get the sound out of it when you just blow it or strike it. subtle energies in, major effects out. And he can only do that through art, which is right brain. Any questions on that one? Question over here.
Should the numbers on the left be reversed? Negative, negative on the bottom?
Yeah, you could do that. Sure. You could do that. I just wrote them over no particular location.
I'm not trying to be too technical here, but the one on the negative side, as it swings out, the bottom one, would that be or negative, negative?
Right. Yeah.
Negative, negative. Negative, negative coming in because the negative side is contracting. Is the contractile force, the attractive force towards the center. Negative attracts to the center. Positive goes out. So when it goes out, it's positive. When it goes out, it's positive.
Okay, I understand. All right, thanks for clarifying that.
About running out of things here. Need some questions. Here's a good one. This is some work I did in 88, 87, 88, whatever. I was trying to figure out how to determine a keynote, a person's keynote, and do it empirically so that we know what we're talking about. We're just not dreaming stuff up. And there's a lot in this chart. Basically, we start out here in the key of C, and going around this direction, you can see how the notes extend away from the center on this side, and then they contract back towards the beginning point again. If we assume that the Earth goes around the Sun, and we call this March 21st, at the beginning point, which is the beginning of the cycle of the Earth around the Sun, not January 1st, March 21st, goes around the Sun all the way back to March 20th, then we could say that any time period, if we divide, I got this divided into 14 sections instead of 12, and there's a good reason for that. In conventional music, there are 7 whole notes. And then there's 5 half notes, which are the sharps and the flats. On the piano keyboard, the white notes are the 7 notes, and the black keys are the half tones. That gives us 12. That's where the zodiac got his 12 signs from, dividing a whole into 7 harmonious parts. That's the octave of music. However, if we take music theory into account, in certain regards, every key has to have its opposite key. So we got 7 basic keys, 7 basic tones. We've got 7 basic half tones, which gives us 14. So I was trying to preserve the principle of duality in this chart when I put it together. Now there are 12 keys that we can create music in. There are also 2 other keys which happen to be the same as 2 of the others. So they only use 12, which is fine. But mathematically there's 14, 2 being duplicates of 2 others. So I laid out the 14 on here. And it works. It really does work. I developed this chart to build a wind chime tuned to an individual person. So I could determine what their keynote was, and then I could derive all the other notes that would go into conformity with the planet, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Question, I think Henry's going.
I just, the astronomers have been attacking the astrologers recently, and one of the evidence that they use to back up as opposed to the fraudulence of astrology is that there's 13 signs rather than 12. You know, astronomers got another sign. I forget the name of it right now, but they could very well be a more balanced chart with 14, as you're saying here right now. And also, I like your comments on how do you think Walter Russell's stuff fits in this. Does Walter Russell's stuff match what you're talking about here very well from your point of view?
Yeah, I haven't read a whole lot of Walter's stuff. What I have read matches almost exactly. Tim and I were going to get together. In fact, we've reiterated our agreement to get together and write a treatise on comparing Russell and Keely together. We haven't just had time to do that. The other question about Tim Binder. The other question about 13 versus 12 and 14 and 64 and everything else. For every music theory book written, you got a different theory. And it is incredibly unknown, you know. And I think, I don't know what the answer is. You know, you look at one system and then we got 12 notes and you say, well, the next note's 13. That's the first note of the next octave instead of 7 and 8. Or, you know, where does this 13 come from? Where does this 7 come from? Where do all these things come from? And you can go to India and you get a 64-note octave. So that, I think somewhere in this murkiness of musical theory, the principles of 1 becoming 3, which doubles, and then you got the 7, and how all that evolves, just like Genesis, you know, it starts with 1 and then it goes into 6 and 7. You got 3 octaves. It happens 3 times in Genesis. So we have all these different, there's a fundamental thing here, and I've said for years and years and years, that once we resolve this question of how these numbers evolve from the 1 number, using these natural principles, universal principles, we're going to answer a lot of things when that happens, and we're getting kind of close to it. A question there.
Can you walk through an example of how you would find a person's musical note on that?
Sure.
Just use a person.
If we use conventional technology to determine a keynote, you know, how they do that is they take an object and they zap frequencies at it until it responds in a resonant mode, until it starts to resonate. And then we know what its resonant frequencies are. You can't really do that with a human being and expect them to survive. So thinking at it from a reverse angle, kind of like this motor over here, we say, well, gee, you know, a human being comes into existence in tune with the universe at the time they're born. The physical organism has to be in tune with the natural forces for it to come into existence, or it probably couldn't. I'm going to take that as a given, that it has to be in tune with the universal forces. If that's true, then it's real simple. We get an astrological chart, throw away the astrology part, keep the astronomy part, say where was the Earth in relation to the Sun when this person was born? And that's mathematics. Nobody can argue with that. And that's what I've done with this chart. So if we say this is March 21st, the beginning of the solar year, and we divide this circle into 365 days, the Earth going around the Sun is what it is, then we find out what day you're born on, and we could read right off this chart what your keynote is. It's that simple. And then we can do the same thing with all the planets. Where were they in relation to the Sun when the person was born? Because that configuration of the planets is, an exemplification, is the universal force at that time. Because they wouldn't be where they are unless the universal forces put them there. So they're obeying natural law just like everything else. So they're going to be where they're supposed to be. So we can go back and take a snapshot of those forces using this as a key, that the musical notes as they evolve from keys. And it's a very complicated, it's not that it's complicated, it's that it takes a lot of insight to understand the evolution of music through keys. I haven't yet understood that. But I see the process. It goes up 5 steps and comes down 4 steps, something like that. And then the keys evolve one from another. And it's a natural thing. This is the natural way sound and music progresses. Getting back to a question someone was going to ask me is part of this thing, too. Natural music is not the same thing as artificial music, what we hear every day on the radio. Natural tones will evolve into subharmonics and superharmonics as shown somewhat as we've shown on this chart. They will naturally create these tones. If you sound this tone, these all sound at the same time. I mean, it's instant, they're there. Maybe we can't hear them, but they're still there. They're always there. I just lost my thought. When we sound a keynote, as you were born on a given day, you're going to have that keynote. Let's say you're born March 22nd, to kind of make it easy. Key of C is the first note that has evolved from this natural process. So we have the numbers and the frequencies will naturally correlate with each other. They naturally evolve from it. It's a natural thing. It's kind of like the Fibonacci series, which is musical, by the way, versus man-made music, which they got together, I think it was 1934 or 24, and they says the note A ought to be 440 cycles per second, because from that number we can tune all the other instruments, and every music written in every country can be played on every instrument in every country, and it all sounds good. Well, that's the key right there. That's where it falls apart. It sounds good. Nature doesn't care one whit what we think. It sounds good, it sounds bad, it don't care. Nature is natural, and it will do what nature will do. When we create artificial ideas about what we think is good, and you know, we start stumbling along the way, and that's what's happened. Part of what's happened.
Does nature have a tuning mechanism? Like, how would you start your basses? What would be a natural sound that you could start for, say, a bass note? And the other question is that why the human voice potentially is more harmonic and easier on the ears, easier on the body for tuning than... Anyway, the first question, is there anything in nature that will give you a bass note rather than an instrument? Or is that a goofy question?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a good question.
Like 8 cycles per second of the earth, or the waves, or...
You know, I had that same question years ago, and I said, well, where do we start? You know, what's the frequency, what's the benchmark frequency we can hang everything on? And there's only one. That's right there. You got to start with one. 1 cycle per second, 1 cycle per time interval. And then from that, through the natural mode that these things evolve into each other, you will get all this other stuff will fall out of it. You will all naturally fall out, naturally, sequentially. And that is your benchmark, is 1. And going back to the ancient metaphysical and mystical viewpoints of things, there is only one. One God, one force, one energy, one whatever. And everything else is a subset. The how and the why that takes place is what got me into this stuff, is trying to answer that. How and the why. You know, how did the void become materiality? So, what was the second part of your question?
I just thought of something else that I'd like to share with you that was on TV. A man was raising alligators. He had them in his basement, and he had them for years. And his wife, no one in the neighborhood knew. It was in a very quiet residential area. And his wife got into kind of a sewing group. And they had all these sewing machines. And she had the ladies over one afternoon, and they were all working their sewing machines. And the drone that started, the sound that was made by the sewing machine started the alligators in the basement roaring. Mm-hmm. And people wondered what was going on, and she explained that it was the pipes, you know, the water pipes in the basement. They were having a problem with their plumbing. Well, this went into a research project, and they were trying to figure out what note was it that started these alligators to do that. So they had a musician, and they thought, well, that particular note was, say, a B flat or something and they had a big tuba. And so they went out to... And this was all with the cameras. They were doing this live. They went to I think it was the Everglades or somewhere where there was just infestations of alligators. So they were playing this note on the bridge, and there wasn't one sound. The alligators didn't make any noise. So they thought, well, gee, so much for that theory. But a man who happened to be standing on the bridge heard about this thing, and he said, well, why don't you recreate the environment? It was in a basement. It was you know, there must have been sound waves bouncing off the wall. So they took the same experiment and went to a zoo where they had the cement walls and all these alligators around, and he played that same note. And lo and behold, all of them started this tremendous sound, and it was resonating the same note as the musical instrument. I'm sorry, this had nothing to do with it, but it was just...
Oh, yes, it does. Actually, it does. It's a very good analogy. You know, if we all resonate to those fundamental tones that we're in tune with. You know, whatever our fundamental tone is. Mine happens to be D flat. And that manifests in many different ways. For instance, in color, it's kind of an off red, kind of towards the orange colors. And when I first determined this, I said, well, I didn't like that. You know, I like blue. I always bought everything blue. And I said, well, I got to verify or live my research if I'm going to talk to other people. And so I started buying clothes that color, and bought a car that color, and I started associating with that color. And very quickly I began to see that really was my color, not the blue. See, my artificial self liked blue, and my inner self resonated to this other color. So if we can learn these correspondences between the notes and the colors and all the other aspects of our lives, and bring all these things into harmony, pretty soon, guess what? We can live in peace and harmony. We can begin to have a decent lifestyle instead of whatever. So you're right. People and items resonate to certain keynotes or fundamental tones. And it behooves everyone to find out what those are and adapt it. Question over here.
Does this tone have anything to do with the pitch of ringing that you will hear in your ears? And if so, why does that sometimes fluctuate up and down at certain moments?
I don't know if I can answer that. I haven't studied the ear like I wish I had time to do. There is a gentleman in Washington State somewhere who's doing that research, and he thinks that that's true, that the canal in the ear is a reflection of the tones of the body. Of course, it has to be. There has to be a concordance with every aspect of your body with your fundamental tone, or your body would start to come apart. And that is what disease is discord. So when your body and all the systems and organs begin to get in discord with each other, yeah, that's disease. That's right there. So you bring it all into harmony. So, yeah, and the pitch of your voice and all these things like Sherry Edwards does are all part and parcel of the whole thing. We are a whole organism in every aspect. In every aspect has to be maintain a relationship, as we talked about the relativity of musical tones. Those vibrations have to be relative one to another. To give you a perfect example of this, I had this little theory in the back of my mind about this relativity business. And I ran into an article in the Sound and Vibration magazine. It's a technical magazine. An engineer had taken a plate, a square metal plate, and vibrated it like I was answering on this other question, to where it began to resonate. So he found the resonant frequencies of this plate, and he listed 4 or 5 or 6 of these frequencies, which he called modes, vibration modes of this plate. And this article, I've been looking for this article for a long time. Here's an engineer, not associated with myself, did this very empirical, very accurate, very precise analysis of this wave plate, a vibrating metal plate. And he had this list of frequencies. And these frequencies didn't have any relationship at all one to another, like we did here, very simply shown how they relate using simple numbers. But I had a little computer program I had been working on for a long time, and I ran those frequencies that he had through the computer program. And every single frequency he found formed a musical interval with the other frequencies, with some other frequency of that set. And they were within 1/100th of a frequency to be an exact musical interval. And that's enough preciseness in any engineering thing to say this is exact, this is what's going on. It was really marvelous that here is a metal plate that wasn't designed to be any kind of musical instrument, and all it puts out is musical intervals. Well, engineers are taught to read the harmonics. They are never taught about the partials that form between the harmonics, as in the 7 musical notes. They're taught to look at the first note and the 8th note, but never the other ones. So they're losing it all. They just don't have access to it. And this simple little experiment that he did and that I matched up with a little bit of arithmetic showed harmony in the midst of his chaos. So that's kind of the neat thing finding. You know, here we can find health by looking at it from a holistic viewpoint, where a doctor would find disease, which he can't treat because he doesn't know. It's that simple. Of question in the back.
I've been studying the case of Charlotte King, the lady who hears the earth before earthquakes. And duct wall vibration in a lot of buildings bother her, and that apparently is part of the sick building syndrome, is vibration of duct walls. And one thing she hears is 8 cycles per second, which she just said was sets off the alligators. Have you seen photographs of the vibrations of the water dancing on the back of an alligator when it's roaring with that vibration?
I haven't seen that particular experiment.
It's dancing water is what you might call it.
Yeah. There is an experiment you can do at home, though. You can take a speaker, turn it up, face up, put a pan of like a cake pan, put just a little bit of water in this cake pan and turn your speaker on whatever sound source, could be hi-fi or a microphone or whatever, and get the surface of this water to vibrating. It will form little spheres of water that will dance around on top of this water surface like you're talking about. It's really fascinating. And then you can empty your pan out and put other things like flour or lycopodium dust or whatever, and it is really extraordinary. It's kind of like Hans Jennings' tape where he shows these different substances vibrating. It's called visible sound. In the 1860s and 70s, they made all these little neat instruments where they could show sound by vibrating dust patterns.
I wanted to comment that Dr. Tomatis of Paris is an ear, nose, and throat specialist who sees the body as developing and around the ear, and it's the response to sound, and that's all I was.
Yeah, there was, I think I met him at a conference in England. Okay. Right. And they were talking about treating cancer with vowel sounds. And they would sing these various tones, and he had a sequence of photographs where they showed this cancerous cell, or cell I guess it was, and it would start to oscillate with this tone. And the oscillation would get bigger and bigger and bigger, and finally it would just explode with pure sound. It's like disrupting water, same thing we were talking about earlier. Certain things, certain tones, resonant frequencies are extremely destructive. These things will add together. The amplitude of the vibrations will add together if the timing is done properly. That's what happens in that motor. You got soldiers walking across a bridge can destroy a perfectly good bridge. That's why they break step walking across bridges. It's the additive synthesis of the power causes these things to happen. Tremendous power can be built up. Any other questions?
I'd heard one explanation of the walls of Jericho coming down because of the harmonics from the trumpets and the shouts. Would that be?
Same thing. If they knew what the frequency of that wall was, they could bring it down, no trouble at all. Just like bringing a bridge down, or Tesla made an oscillator he slapped on the side of a building, caused an earthquake in downtown New York. Almost brought the building down, and just a little tiny little, weighed 2 or 3 pounds, I think it was. You just got it in sync with the vibration of that building, and it just built it up. It's like taking a bathtub full of water. You can push the water towards the end, and if you keep pushing it just right, that water will go right over the side, but at no time did you use that much force. You just added it to what you already did before. It's like a child on a swing. You get a real good swing like that. These new energy devices they're building nowadays are working, some of them are working on that principle. They get a potential and oscillate it back and forth, and they build up this energy. And you can build it up to incredible amounts of energy. And if you had a hole in the end of your bathtub and you've got this thing swinging back and forth, a little bit of water would shoot through that hole every time the wave struck it. Well, you do that with electrical circuits. You just oscillate it back and forth, and it crosses a bridge, and you get a spurt of energy. Well, you do that real quickly, and you can't tell that it's a broken flow. You get these same phenomena to happen. It's real simple. A lot of this stuff's real simple. It's not complicated at all. I want to show you this one thing. We just touched on this, called destruction with sound, or disintegration. A acoustic disintegration. Okay. If we maintain the ratios 1 to 1 to 1 on the 3 modes of vibration, we're going to get a perfect sphere. If that's a molecule in the upper left-hand corner, it's all going to rotate perfectly in concordance and harmony, and it'll be a nice sphere, and it really won't bother anybody. If we start elongating one of the orbits, we'll be introducing a discord to do that. According to what Keely was saying, if the distance exceeded 1 to 4 in ratio, it would break apart. 1 to 4 in ratio. So going back to those photographs of that cell that this guy was oscillating with his voice, it would begin to oscillate, and it got bigger and bigger and bigger, and it finally reached a point where it can't come back. It has to destroy itself, and it will come right apart. So that's the same thing. If we knew all the frequencies that were inherent in an atom, or a molecule in this case, we could take one of them, and if we had real precise timing, we could time it and add it together, just like we're doing in that motor right there. Add that little frequency together, it's going to come apart just like that. And at no time did you hit it with a big sledgehammer, or did you got a nuclear accelerator or whatever. But that's the principle behind the dissociation of water. You begin to expand the orbit by adding to its velocity of rotation to a point where it will finally break apart. And you can do that through this. If we look at this, if we showed all the musical notes in between these harmonics, we could see how music bridges the material realm to the infinite realm of mind and so-called God energies. Casey said that over and over and over again. Music is the bridge. It's the only bridge that'll bridge gross materiality to the superfine, subtle, energetic forces. And it's the principles behind what makes music what it is, and that's what we were talking about all day today, is how vibrations add to each other, interact with each other, can become one, can become separate, in harmony or discord. And that's the nature of it. That's why I said in the beginning, the universe is musical. And it operates on the principle of sympathy, which is love. Any questions on that one? We'll look over this one another time. This is really important. This chart is so important. You see down the bottom, matter is bound up energy, and energy is liberated matter. It's 1893. It's 12 years before Einstein wrote his theory on relativity, where he said energy equals mc squared. Well, that's what that says. These guys were working on this stuff years before conventional science began to even look at it. That's the same year that the electron was admitted to exist. You know, they were working on electricity in those days. They finally began to have electricity predominant in society, and they really didn't know what electricity was. There was a theory that this thing called electron had something to do with electricity, and they were all messing around with it. And I'm pretty sure it was Rutherford who finally got the credit for establishing the electron as a particle of electricity. Another thing, here's a really interesting thing. If it's true that the faster something goes, the denser it gets, the more energy it's got, and if what Keely said was true about the ether, that it was 986,000 times denser than steel, you know, steel would be in here, or it'd be down in here someplace, because steel is carbon and iron. We'll get up here to the etheric realm. So this is almost 1,000,000 times denser than this realm down here. There's 1,000,000 times more energy here than here. That's why we got a lot more power in uranium than we have in chemicals like dynamite. So uranium is an interatomic force, or nuclear explosions are an interatomic force, versus dynamite, which is a molecular force. If it's true that that range of density exists there, then that means we are bubbles in the ether. It's exactly reverse of what we think it is. So we're not denser than the subtler forces. we are more tenuous than the subtler forces. And it's a hard thing to grasp, but the more you think about it, it's the only way it can be. And Asimov once wrote a book, I think it was on water. And I've been looking for that book for years, I haven't been able to find it. And he said, if ether was this, that, and the other thing, then it would have to be 400,000 times denser than steel, and it's absurd. He said that in his book. I remember that to this day. Well, let's put the absurdity aside. Let's put our own viewpoints aside, and let's look at it in a physical sense. If this chart has any accuracy to it at all, then that is true. And if that is true, then our physical organism, this lectern, the whole planet, is a bubble in this real, very dense media we call the ether. So you say, well, how can we move around in it? Well, a bubble in water, an air bubble in water is less dense than the water, and it moves around the water. Doesn't have a whole lot of integrity, like, but it does have its existence. Got 1 minute. Is there a quick question? Especially on this bubble stuff, how I can move around the bubble. The theory of how that works is we go from the fine etheric levels. We got that fine etheric point about which molecules, atoms, all vibrations can concentrate, can aggregate. They centralize these forces about this infinite center. Well, some guys theorize that this happens 4 billion times a second, 4 quadrillion times a second. So we come in and out of materiality 4 quadrillion times a second. And that's an astounding theory to think about. So if you want to know more about this and want to get more material, stop at my book table. We've got all kinds of stuff over there. We've got scrapbooks. You can see pictures and photographs. And I thoroughly enjoyed having spoken to you today. Thank you.
Thank you much.